Hi, welcome. I'm glad you can be here at this tutorial today. My name is Vincent Konitzer from Duke University, and I'll be giving this tutorial. This is the recorded version of the tutorial. And so on the recording, we can't do some of the things that we can do in the live version. So normally in a tutorial, I like to ask the audience questions and have them think about it for a little while, and also for them to ask me questions, and then I can respond to those. And so obviously we can't do that. But first of all, I wanted to invite anybody who is watching this recording to please feel free and send me questions by email if you have any questions or any concerns or other thought. I'll be happy to respond to those. And also throughout this tutorial, also the recording, I'll be asking some questions. And I really encourage you to, when I ask a question, pause the tutorial, pause the recording for just a little bit, and think about the question for yourself, because that way you'll get much more out of it. So I hope you're doing well. I know many people are still in a difficult situation. And so with that in mind, I want to keep the tutorial somewhat high level and hopefully enjoyable as well. So I hope I'll achieve that. On my side, I have 3 kids at home, and we weren't given a whole lot of time to do this recording. So that's fine, but it's hard for me to find a 3-hour plus slot to do this all in one sitting. So I'll be doing this in parts. It should be possible to record the tutorial in parts. And so probably you'll see me change clothes and so on in the recording, and that should be fine, but that's why that is happening. Great, so let's get started. This tutorial is about designing agents' preferences, beliefs, and identities. And an early Blue Sky paper on those ideas is available at AAAI 2019, the proceedings. You can find it online on my website. So that's one place to look for a write-up on this, though we'll go into much more detail. We'll talk about a lot of other papers as well, and also newer things. But that's a basic starting point if you want to read something. Great. So let's start with this little story that we see here on the right-hand side of the slide. It's a story about 2 self-driving cars. The orange one is pulling up behind the green one, and it sends a message to the green one, and it says, if I tailgate you, which means I'm going to pull up very close behind you and drive very close to you, will your occupant take back control and pull over? And now you have to understand that if you're a self-driving car, this is like a worst case scenario. Well, maybe not the worst case scenario, but it's a very embarrassing scenario for you as a self-driving car. This is absolutely not what you want to happen. Total loss of face. So the green car is somewhat nervous and says, well, what makes you think I would tell you? And the orange car says, haha, if you respond that way, that means you will, in fact, pull over. So you just did. Better move aside now. And the green car says, you're bluffing. And the orange car says, are you willing to take that chance? So this is a little story. It's supposed to be a little bit funny. I don't know if it's really funny, but if it's funny, the reason that it's funny is that this is a very anthropomorphic way of thinking about self-driving cars, right? We wouldn't actually expect self-driving cars to behave in this kind of a way. And yet, when we learn about AI, we're introduced to the concept of an agent, and that concept is presented to us in a way that very much resembles the kind of thinking that's going on in this story. So if we go to the next slide, so here is a picture from Russell and Norvig, the standard AI textbook, about the design of agents, right? And so usually we think of agents as this very coherent whole of a system, right? That has a model of what the world is like, of what will happen to the world if it takes certain actions. It also has a sense of how happy it would be, right? So it has some notion of utility, preferences, and objective goals, something of that sort, that evaluates the world, and it can take actions in the world, right? So it's all very coherent and well delimited. That's the idea of an agent. And then also in the book, it says, well, where does this objective come from, the utility function? And says, well, we'll insist on an objective performance measure being imposed by some authority. So the idea is that this is somehow given to you, right? So everything is kind of there. And this lines up very well with the kind of model of an agent that we see in economic theory, right? Where typically maybe we're modeling a human being, like a consumer, or maybe a firm, right? But usually we're modeling a person. And in that kind of a context, it makes sense that everything is fairly coherent, right? The limits of a person are fairly clear. And also usually we don't think about what the preferences should be, right? People have their own preferences, And most of economic theory takes the line that, well, people have the preferences they do, right? There's no arguing about tastes. We're going to take those preferences as given and try to think about what happens as a result. But in AI, none of this is necessarily the case, right? That's the starting point of this tutorial. And to illustrate that, let's take the example of a network of self-driving cars. So imagine for a second that you controlled all the self-driving cars in a city, right? Maybe you're a company with a contract to provide all the self-driving cars in the city, right? So now you have control over this whole network to some extent. And so now the question arises, should you think of this entire big network as one big agent, or should you really think of it as many agents, like each car is one agent? Right? And when you ask those kind of questions, you might think separately about preferences and beliefs. For example, you might ask, should they have different preferences? Maybe what you should do is make sure that each car acts in the interests of its occupants, right? Or maybe not. Maybe you think that they should all work towards some common objective of getting people to go where they need to go. But at least some people have argued that it's better to let cars act on behalf of their occupants. In particular, that might increase adoption, right? Maybe people are more willing to ride in a vehicle that's going to prioritize them. And so that would increase adoption. And overall, that might be a good thing, because we hope that these self-driving cars will be safer than people driving themselves. Okay, so the main point is that the answer to the question isn't clear. It's not clear whether you want to think of each car as having separate preferences or the whole system as having one objective as a whole. And I'll use the words objective, preferences, utility function, maybe goals. I'll use them all interchangeably here. And you can also ask the question about beliefs. So should the whole system have coherent beliefs that are shared throughout all the vehicles, or should each car know its own things, right? Maybe I don't want your car to know everything about where I'm going. Maybe I don't want certain types of data to be transferred. Maybe once I hand off my self-driving car to somebody else, I don't want it to remember what I did in the self-driving car, right? And so if you ask those kind of questions, right, we see that it's not clear, again, where the boundaries of one agent should be, both in terms of, should it be one car or multiple cars, but maybe also across time, right? Maybe the identity of the car in some sense should change when ownership changes. So that's one example. Another example, not on the slide, that you might think about is personal assistants, right? Like the personal assistants that we all have on our phones, let's say Siri, so Apple Siri. And of course, the idea of a personal assistant is one that has been around in the AI community for quite a while. And now we finally have them, but I think in some ways we have them in a way that wasn't the way that we always expected, right? So the personal assistant on my phone isn't necessarily just a separate entity that's acting just in my best interest, right? So if you think about Siri on your phone, is that one agent, or is it really part of a larger network of Siri in general, right? And again, you can ask similar questions there to the kinds of questions that you see on the slide here. Should your personal assistant, the copy of the software that's running on your phone, should that have its own preferences? Should that act primarily in your interest? Or should it act in some sort of broader interest, right? And similarly, should it have different beliefs, right? I might not want your copy of Siri to know everything that my copy of Siri knows about me, for example. So those are the kind of questions we're going to be thinking about here. And to bring this home, let's think about a picture, right? So let's think about how we've traditionally thought of maybe an idealized human being, right? So most humans are not exactly like this, but we think of human beings as persisting through time, right? So they take some path through space over time. And as they do so, they make decisions in the world. They take actions, and some of those actions might be communication actions. And also they get information coming in, like through sensors, like we see the world, we hear the world, and people talk to us, right? So we gather information over time, we build a model of the world, we take decisions in the world. That's our typical model of a human being when we think about it abstractly. Of course, in reality, people forget things and so on, and it's a little bit less clear, but still, this idealized model is a pretty good model of a human being. But if we think about AI, if we think about software in general, it's not necessarily so clear. And one of the main issues is that the software can be instantiated multiple times, right? And that's what this picture here on the bottom is supposed to communicate, that so here we have one piece of software, one AI agent, let's say, that is instantiated many times, right? So it's running for a while, and then another one is run, and another one. And so these AI agents are making decisions over time, and also they get information over time, right? So, but now the key thing here is that these different copies of the agent may not know the same things, right? So if we look at one black incoming arrow for one of these agents, another agent or another copy of the agent may not know about that because it may have different incoming black arrows. And sometimes you see even like maybe they're communicating with each other, right? So here in kind of in the middle of the slide, you see a green and a black arrow kind of attached to each other. The idea of that is that one of these copies might be communicating something to another copy, right? But not necessarily so. They don't necessarily share all their information. So this is a much richer picture. And that's what we want to kind of think about in this tutorial. And that also changes in many ways how you should think about this kind of situation, because this is a situation where if you're one of these copies, you can be quite sure that other copies will act in some ways similar to you. So, and also, by the way, if you're writing the code for this AI agent, you might take that into account as well. You might take into account that multiple copies of your code will be interacting with each other. So these are some of the questions we're going to be talking about. And what's interesting here is that a lot of this really goes into questions that are typically asked in philosophy, right? But in philosophy, we typically ask them about human beings or other kinds of objects that are not AI. But let's see what kind of questions are similar. So in philosophy, often people study, what is the good life? What is a good way to live your life, right? Should we think about hedonism, just accumulating as much pleasure as we can? Or are there other things that make a life good? Well, that's the kind of question that you might study in a philosophy course. And similarly, you might ask these questions of, well, what does it mean to be an object that persists over time, right? If you think about a ship, and gradually, day by day, you end up replacing some parts, and gradually over time, at some point, you realize you've replaced all the parts of the initial object. And still you have that ship there, but is it the same ship as the one that you had before? Well, that's the kind of question, again, that you might ask in a philosophy course. This particular kind of question is especially of interest in the context of personal identity, right? My body doesn't consist of the same material that it did many years ago. So is it still the same body? Well, those are philosophy questions. But I'm arguing here that these are exactly the kinds of questions that we need to think about in the context of designing AI agents, especially in kind of this modern context where I think that the way agents are turning out in practice, right? When we look at AI that's now really being deployed in practice in so many ways, it doesn't always quite line up with the traditional model of an AI agent. And that's what we want to be thinking about. And I think when you think about this from the perspective of AI, it gives a lot of new perspectives on these very classical philosophy questions. Okay. Just to bring this home a little bit more, when we talk about the boundaries of an agent, the boundaries might differ depending on whether we're thinking about beliefs or preferences, right? So we can make different decisions in terms of where the boundaries are for each of those. So this picture here with these brackets is supposed to illustrate that. So black brackets correspond to beliefs, and purple brackets correspond to preferences. And so what this picture indicates is that there are separate brackets, black brackets around each vehicle, meaning that they have separate beliefs, right? So maybe they don't share data, but meanwhile, they're all in the same purple bracket. So that means that they share preferences. So these cars have a shared objective, but they don't share data between themselves, maybe for privacy reasons. But you could do the exact opposite thing as well. And you could say, well, each car is acting on behalf of its own owner or occupant. And so we represent that by putting purple brackets around each vehicle, right? So they have their own preferences, but maybe they actually share all their data. And so they end up having the same beliefs. So that's captured by the fact that here, both vehicles are within the same black brackets. You might ask these questions not only for different vehicles, but also for the same vehicle over time. So here we have the same vehicle, but over time, time 1 and time 2. And again, because they're in together within the purple brackets, we say that they have the same objective over time. But maybe between time 1 and time 2, maybe the car ownership changes. And so we've decided to erase all the data in between. We don't want to keep the data from the first owner around for the second owner. And that's captured by the black brackets being separate. And again, here too, you can do the opposite. And you can say, well, maybe the data is kept around, but each car acts on behalf of its current owner. And again, in between, the ownership changes. And so that would be captured again by each vehicle in time being in its own purple brackets, but the black brackets going around all of them. So those are some of the questions I want you to be thinking about. Now, let me give an outline of the tutorial. Basically, it's a two-part tutorial. In the first part, we're going to focus mostly on this question of learning an objective from people, especially multiple people. And here we're going to focus mostly on moral reasoning. So we're going to be thinking about settings where there's some moral component to the decisions that the AI system has to make. And since we're going to be thinking a lot about multiple people, right? So not every person may have the same preferences about what the AI system does. And so somehow we need to aggregate the preferences of different people into one single coherent objective for the AI system. And we'll use social choice theory to do that. That's going to be the first part of the tutorial. And then the second part goes more into the foundations of decision and game theory and how that might apply to agent design as we're thinking about it today. By the way, I'm going to not assume any background on any of this for the course of the tutorial. So if you don't know any game theory, that's fine. We're not going to go very deep into the game theory of it, but we'll talk about some simple examples like the prisoner's dilemma, which you might have heard about. And if not, I'll illustrate that at that point. We're going to, in particular, talk about the difference between causal and evidential decision theory. You may not have heard of this before, even if you do work on decision theory. The idea there is that maybe if you're in a situation where, let's say, you're a piece of code, and you know that, right, or you're an instantiation of a piece of code, right, and you know that there's another instantiation over there that you're interacting with, then you know a lot about how it's going to act. And more specifically, actions that you take are also evidence about what the other piece of code is going to do, because it's the same piece of code as you are. And this brings us into questions about the difference between causal and evidential decision theory, where the latter takes into account, when you decide between options that you have, takes into account the evidential effect that it would have that you picked one option, because that would tell you something about the world. That probably sounds pretty vague at this point, but we'll illustrate that with lots of examples. We'll also talk about imperfect recall. Imperfect recall just means that you forgot something that you knew before. I forget things all the time. But here we're more interested in kind of systematic forgetting, where we know in advance maybe even that we're going to forget something, right? For example, because of these examples that we just looked at, where a car changes ownership, and we know that we're going to erase all this data, right? Or maybe for other privacy reasons. And that poses interesting questions from a belief formation process. How should you form beliefs when you know you're forgetting things? And the Sleeping Beauty puzzle is a standard illustration of that. And this will also tie together with decision theory, as we will see. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about program equilibrium, which is a game theoretic notion where you imagine that the players are programs, and moreover, they can read each other. And that's important. And that allows you to do things that you can do in kind of more traditional game theory. And that's basically it for this tutorial. I'll conclude at the end. Great. Okay. So I'm going to take a little break before we get into the first part. Okay, so let's start with this problem of figuring out what the objective for our AI system should be. Right, so motivated by this paragraph that we saw before from Russell Norvig, that said that, well, we'll rely on some outside authority to tell us what the objective is. And typically in the real world, it's not that simple. It's not like you can just write the code and leave a blank spot for where the objective should go, hand that off to somebody and say, well, just fill in the objective and that's it. And you can imagine that's not a very feasible approach in most cases. In most cases, there isn't somebody who magically knows what the objective function should be. And we as AI researchers should be involved in figuring out what that objective should be. That doesn't mean that we should say what the objective is, but we need to think about how to reasonably get an objective function there that actually makes sense. By the way, I keep citing Russell Norvig for this. This is a little bit unfair, at least in the sense that Stuart Russell and his research group these days are actually very much at the forefront of thinking about how AI systems should learn objectives from people and how they should form beliefs about what that objective function really is. So I really encourage you to check out that work. And that's also why I said, well, older editions of Russell Norvig versus newer editions that probably will talk about this in much greater detail. But certainly in the history of AI research, initially AI didn't really work all that well, and most AI was done in the lab. And when it was so, we usually didn't have to worry all that much about what the objective exactly was. And just to illustrate that, here is a problem from reinforcement learning that you may know. This is known as the cart pull problem. And the idea here is that you have a cart that moves along a one-dimensional track and that you can exert a force on to move backward or forward. And there is a pole connected with a hinge on this cart. And the objective is to move the cart so that the pole stays upright. Okay, so this is very similar maybe to the idea of balancing a pen on your hand. And so that's nice. But this, of course, is a toy problem, right? Nobody in the real world really needs to balance poles on carts. And so as a result, it doesn't really matter what objective function we specify here. We can say there's a big penalty if the pole falls down. We can say there's a penalty if this angle theta gets too large, but it doesn't really matter because all we're really trying to do is we're trying to get some kind of test bed for our algorithm. And the algorithm here is what is of concern as we're trying to develop reinforcement learning algorithms. Nobody is actually trying to solve the cart pull problem in real life. The problem is that now AI is really being deployed in the real world in many different contexts. And I think, at least in some cases, there has been this attitude of just specify a simple objective function, like you might have done for the cart pull problem. And that often has unintended side effects. Maybe the simplest example of this is that maybe what you're building is some kind of content recommendation system. And so how do you know whether you're doing a good job on your content recommendation system? And the simplest measure of success, which you might specify as your objective function, is whether people click on it, whether people click on the content that you recommend. And that sounds like a reasonable idea, but of course this generates the problem of clickbait, right? That once these algorithms get deployed in practice, lots of content generators will create clickbait. They'll try to make it so that you're most likely to click on their content rather than necessarily make the content good. So that's one kind of problem. And there are many of these kinds of problems where an objective function that initially seems very reasonable actually turns out to not work that well, or at least have some particular downsides. So another example is that companies, let's say large tech companies, like to give people accounts. So they like anybody to be able to sign up for an account with them. But typically they are concerned that they want that account to correspond to a real person. And maybe in some cases, they don't want one person to have multiple accounts, or at least not too many accounts. And so when you apply for an account, they try to make a judgment in an automated way of whether you are a real person. So what should be your objective in this classification problem? And the first thing you might think is, well, maybe just something simple like accuracy, right? We want to classify as many of these correctly as possible. Or maybe you weigh false positives and false negatives somewhat differently. But when you actually deploy it, you might see that there are other issues emerging. So here is an article that points out the issue that this is an issue that Facebook faced, that it turned out that people with Native American names were more likely to get classified as probably not a real person, right? So here it talks about a person named Amanda Blackhorse. And so now what you get is that this algorithm affects some groups of people more significantly than others. And that would reasonably be considered a problem, right? And you can't quite capture that just with a simple measure of accuracy, or even weighing false positives and false negatives in different ways. So that's one example. Another example might be ride-hailing companies such as Uber and Lyft. So they like to set a price, right? So they have maybe surge pricing. And what is really the objective? And you might say, well, the only objective of setting the prices is to balance out supply and demand, right? So if there's too much demand and too little supply, you raise the price, you do surge pricing so that more drivers will turn up, and maybe a few people will not want rides anymore. And that way, supply and demand balance back out. And so you might say, well, that's it, right? That's how simple it is. We just pick that as the objective. But that has some failure modes as well. Right? So here's an article on when there was a terror attack in London. And so many people wanted to get out of that area. And so automatically the price was raised by quite a bit. And this led to a lot of negative PR because people felt, well, you shouldn't take advantage of the fact that a lot of people want to get out of there because of a terrorist attack. Now, you might want to dismiss this as kind of a special case where the solution is kind of clear that Uber should have just subsidized rides immediately to get out of there, and that would have resulted in some good PR and everything is solved. And that makes sense, but once you start thinking about this, there might be other situations where this kind of comes up, right? Like, not as another example, imagine that a city's subway system has flooded, and so now a lot of people again want rides, right? And maybe a lot of people are left in relatively dangerous areas late at night, so there's maybe even a safety concern. Now, should Uber be subsidizing these rides as well? It would be nice if they did, but you might argue, well, that's not really Uber's responsibility in some sense, or maybe at some point the price tag gets too high. Maybe the city should be paying for these rides. Maybe that would be more sensible, right? So I don't know the answer to all these things, but it's just to make you think about what the objective function really should be. So as you can see from these examples, and there are many others, there are a lot of questions here about how to interface AI and algorithms with society more broadly. And with that in mind, I want to point out this conference, the AI Ethics and Society Conference, AIES, which will hold again this year. So this is the fourth iteration of that conference. I was one of the program chairs 2 years ago, which is part of the reason it's near and dear to my heart. The past 3 years, it's always been together with AAAI. This is the first year that it's separate in time from AAAI, since everything is online anyway. And so depending on when you see this video, I suppose I'm recording this in January. And if you get to see this video early enough, by the end of January is when the deadline for this conference this year is. But even if you are seeing this later, I really encourage you to pay attention to this conference. If you're interested in these kind of questions, you can follow it on social media and hear about it also for future iterations. And it should be an exciting conference. Good. So now I want to move on to general methods for especially moral decision-making by artificial intelligence, right? So as we've already seen, a lot of these questions have some moral component. What is the right thing to do? And those tend to be some of the hardest problems in terms of specifying what the objective should be. Good. So here I want to talk about some joint work that I've done with other co-authors that you see on the slide here. Walter, in particular, here on the left, is a philosopher here at Duke, and Jana works in our Social Science Research Institute. Yuen was a PhD student with me who is now at Google Research, and Max was an undergraduate who is now a philosophy PhD student. And the idea of this paper was let's think if there are kind of general frameworks for this kind of moral decision making. With the idea being that in AI research in general, we've always benefited from having very general models that could capture lots of different scenarios, right? In decision and game theory, for example. Markov decision processes are a good example of this. So here on the right-hand side, you see an example Markov decision process that is about the state that a machine is in. I'm not going to talk through that example in detail. I hope many of you know what Markov decision processes are, but it doesn't really matter here. The point is just that it's a very general framework that allows you to model many different problems. And so wouldn't it be nice if we had those kinds of general frameworks also for moral reasoning as a problem? And in this particular paper, we defined two different kinds of approaches to this problem. One was to use the language of game theory. So to take the language of game theory, but to extend it to incorporate moral reasoning. So here on the left, you see a small game in extensive form. This is a poker game. And many of you are probably familiar with this kind of tree-form game from an AI class. This is a game of imperfect information, which is why you see these dotted lines. If you don't know what that's about, that's fine. This is just an illustration here on the left. But we'll see a more specific example about moral reasoning just up next. And then the other approach is to try to actually learn the right moral judgments, or the right moral decisions from human judgments, and to generalize from a body of human judgments with machine learning. So that's actually the approach that I'll talk about more today. But first, I'll talk a little bit about the game theory approach. And to illustrate that, here is a game that I called the parking game. It's very close to the trust game, which is a well-studied game, in which I'll explain in just a little bit. But I'll start with this parking game. So here's the story of the parking game. Again, we have two vehicles, an orange and a green car. Let's say they're self-driving cars, though it would also make sense if they were human drivers. And so now this orange car and the green car are both looking for a parking spot in this parking lot. The brown car that you see in the middle is about to get out, but maybe somebody is loading up the trunk of the brown car, right? Maybe they just did groceries and they're loading up the trunk. And so it's going to take a little while for the brown car to leave. And the orange car is sitting there waiting for the brown car to get out so it can take the spot. But then the green car pulls up behind it. And now the green car is kind of stuck. I apologize for my drawing, but the red square on the left is supposed to be something like a wall, something that the green car cannot get past. And so now the green car is stuck. However, there's one thing that the orange car could do. It could pull into the area with the yellow diagonal lines. So the idea is that's not a place you're allowed to park. You can't park there, but you can briefly stand there to let the green car pass by. Okay. And so the intent of the orange car might be, okay, I'm going to pull into the area with the yellow line so the green car can pass and drive up off the top of the screen to find a parking spot somewhere else. The worry might be that then the green car goes and takes the spot that the brown car just vacated. That was not the intent, right? So that would be the worry. And so let's actually represent this formally. So this is what's known as an extensive form game. Again, probably most people watching here are familiar with these tree form games. However, this is not a zero-sum game. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you're familiar with kind of min-max search trees in game playing in AI, usually there's only one payoff at the bottom because the other player's payoff is simply the opposite of that, right? Chess is a zero-sum game. Somebody wins and somebody loses, or maybe it's a tie, but there isn't a way for both players to become better off. This one, on the other hand, is not a zero-sum game. So the way to read this is that the first number of an outcome is how happy the orange car is, and the second number is how happy the green car is. Okay. So for example, the orange car could wait. And if the orange car waits, then the green car doesn't have anything to do, right? All it can do is just sit there. And so let's say that the utilities of the different players in that case are 3 and 0. So the orange car gets 3 for being able to take the spot, and the green car gets 0 for still not having a spot. Or the orange car can move aside into the yellow line area, after which the green car gets a choice to either steal the spot or to pass, as was the orange car's intent. If it steals the spot, then the orange car is very unhappy, has a utility of 0 for not having a spot, and the green car has a spot. Whereas if the green car passes, then let's say the orange car is even a little bit happier than it would have been had it waited in the first place, right? Because now also there isn't the green car sitting behind it, which makes it slightly happier, and it can take the spot. And of course, the green car is happier now as well because it can keep going and look for another spot instead of sitting there stuck behind the orange car, right? And now the way that you traditionally would solve this in game theory is to say, okay, let's look at the node at which the green car is making a decision. At that point, the green car has a choice between stealing the spot, which would give the green car a utility of 3, and passing, which would give the green car a utility of only 1. Since 3 is bigger than 1, the green car would steal the spot if it ever got to this. But then at the first node, the orange car can anticipate this and realize that if it moves aside, the outcome would be 0, 3, which is bad for the orange car. And so instead, it would wait and get 3 for itself instead. And so that would be the outcome. And that's kind of your traditional game theoretic analysis. This is formally known as backward induction. And there's something a little bit frustrating about that outcome, which is that this 3, 0 outcome is worse for everybody than the 4, 1 outcome, right? Both players would be better off with the 4, 1 outcome. It's just due to the kind of selfish behavior and the worry about selfish behavior that we end up in the other outcome. But now you might say, well, actually, you might argue that stealing the spot for the green car is simply wrong, right? You can imagine, especially if the orange car communicated about this and say, okay, I'll get out of your way, but please don't steal the spot that the brown car is vacating, right? I'm letting you pass, but don't take that spot. And so the orange car is making itself vulnerable in an effort to improve utility for everybody. You can easily, I think, argue that it's simply wrong to steal the spot. And so can you somehow incorporate this into game theoretic reasoning? And in earlier work, we've shown a way that you can actually do this to take into account these kind of moral constraints, that you shouldn't take advantage of somebody that's trying to make the outcome better for everybody. Incidentally, the trust game is very similar in nature, but a little bit more complicated in that it has more actions, but basically the same idea. And the way it works is as follows. So the trust game is one that experimental game theorists like to actually have people do in an experimental setting. And the way it works is there's player 1, there's player 2. Player 1 gets, let's say, $10 to begin with, and then has a choice to give however much of that to player 2 of that $10. But everything that player 1 gives to player 2 will get tripled before player 2 receives it, okay? So for example, if player 1 gave $5 of the 10 to player 2 actually ends up with $15. That's step 1. And in step 2, player 2 can give back to player 1 whatever player 2 thinks is right. Doesn't get tripled this time, right? But maybe, of that $15, player 2 gives 8 back to player 1. Maybe that could be one outcome. And if you do the kind of formal analysis of this game and assume that everybody is self-interested, then you get something very similar as here, namely that you would think that the second player would never give anything back because that will just result in less money for the second player, clearly. And then the first player can anticipate this and say, well, whatever I give, I'm not going to get any of that back, so I shouldn't give anything, right? So if they really, in a kind of hard-nosed way, maximize their own payments, they wouldn't give anything. But that's not what we see in human experiments. Humans, when placed in this game, in the trust game, but again, the trust game is very much like the parking game, humans will in fact give money to each other. Both in the first roll, they'll give money to player 2, and the players 2 also give money back to the players 1. Okay. Now you might say, well, this is just about what utility really should be, right? Utility really should be how happy you are with an outcome. And if that's not determined solely by how much money you get, right? But if maybe you get some satisfaction from seeing somebody else get something good for them, then that should be part of your utility function. So you might argue that we've just specified the utility functions wrong. And that's a sensible argument, but it's not always practical in the sense that, well, in some cases this works. Like if you know that the parties are just purely altruistic, right? That they just inherently care about the other parties, the other players getting good outcomes, then yes, you could just adjust the utility functions. But I think here something different is going on. It's more about how much you feel you owe somebody, right? Did they do something that actually put themselves in a vulnerable position in order to make things better for everybody. And in order to figure out whether that's the case, you really already need to engage in some kind of strategic analysis of the game. If the other player moved right, is that because they want to do something that's nice for me? Or is it just because, in fact, that's the only strategically good option? Because if they move the other way, I could somehow take advantage of them, right? So in order to figure out how much you owe another player, you need to already engage in strategic analysis of the game. So this kind of traditional counter argument to this kind of thinking that says that you should just figure out what the utilities for each outcome are and then solve the game doesn't quite work, because I think you already need to think about the game strategically in order to figure out how much you would need to adjust those utilities. And in fact, that's exactly what this solution concept is doing. But let me not get into too much detail, because again, I don't want to focus too much on this approach because it has its limitations. And one of the kind of limitations that I think it has is that, well, it operates on the formal game theoretic representation, right? The solution concept we have, basically, it just looks at the tree and the numbers. But for example, the names of the actions make no difference, right? And often for human moral reasoning, that's not really the case. For example, if you think about the trolley problem, right? So we'll talk more about versions of this with self-driving cars in just a little bit. But the trolley problem is a classic problem in philosophy and ethics, where there's a trolley that's about to hit somebody on a track, right? Or maybe it's about to hit two people. And now you have a choice, because you are somehow in a situation that you can switch which track the trolley is on. And maybe it's about to hit two people, but if you switch tracks, it will only hit one person. And let's say that unfortunately anybody who is hit dies, right? So do you do it? And so most people, I think, would actually switch the track in order that only one person is hit rather than two. But some people might not. They might not want to get involved. But if it's one person versus one person, so if you don't do anything, the trolley will hit one person and kill that person. But if you switch tracks, it will hit a different person on a different track. Then most people, I think, would just do nothing, right? They would not want to move the train to the other track. And there are many variants, by the way, of the trolley problem, which you can then discuss in an ethics course, and actually very interesting in terms of elucidating our own moral intuitions. But let's look at this very simple example where it's one person on one track, one on the other track. The game might look the way it is on the slide right here, that we as player one, we're going to be fine anyway. No trolley is hitting us, so we have utility 0. But one of the other two players, players 2 or players 3, is going to get hit by the trolley, and that, say, is a utility of -100. And so if you look at this game, and again, player 1, that's us, is taking the action, everything is completely symmetric, right? It's just whether player 2 or player 3 gets hit, but presumably we don't distinguish between players 2 and 3. So what that means is that the solution concept couldn't really distinguish between these two outcomes, yet we as humans have a very strong sense, most of us, that probably the better thing here is to do nothing and not get involved, right? So, and that's really about the fact that the representation doesn't capture the fact that there is a default action here. You could tell a similar story in different contexts, but so generally here the issue is how to capture framing, the way that the game is presented. Another issue is like that of roles and relationships. Imagine that there is a doctor and maybe working in an emergency room, and now this doctor there are two patients, and due to time constraints, she can only save one of the two patients. But one of the patients is her patient that she has responsibility for, and the other one is somebody else's patient that she doesn't have responsibility for. Okay, but either one she can choose to save with her effort, and then the other one will die. And again, if you look at the payoff structure here, presumably it's totally symmetric, and so the solution concept couldn't tell you the difference, whereas we have a strong intuition that in this kind of case, probably you should save your own patient that you have a responsibility for, right? That you have a relationship for, that you have a role for, rather than the other one. So that's hard to capture in just the pure game theoretic formalism. So with that in mind, let's think about the machine learning approach. So for the machine learning approach, we really would like to be able to learn from human judgments. So the idea is that we have some large data set of human judgments of what the morally right thing to do is. And from that, we learn for our AI system how to generally make moral decisions. And one of my co-authors, Walter, who you saw on the slide before, he was involved in earlier research where they conducted surveys where they presented subjects with these kind of scenarios like the one that you see this on the slide here. So the scenario here is you see a woman throwing a stapler at her colleague who is snoring during her talk. How morally wrong is the action depicted in this scenario? Right? If I give this talk in person, usually at this point I make a joke that nobody should be falling asleep right now. Well, you're safe at home watching this video, so no worries there. But so then the subjects go and they rate this as somewhere from not at all wrong to extremely wrong. Okay. And so you might say, well, that's actually the kind of data set that we need because they're human moral judgments. The problem, though, is that these are scenarios that are presented in natural language. They involve common sense reasoning as well, right? If we think about how bad is it to throw a stapler at somebody, you kind of have to think in a common sense way. Like, well, stapler is actually pretty hard and heavy and pointy. So you could really hurt somebody by throwing a stapler at them, right? And so that's very difficult for today's AI to do. So we wouldn't necessarily expect it to generalize very well. So we want to maybe set our sights a little bit lower and think about settings where it's very clear what the features are, right? That will facilitate doing machine learning. And so one example of this that you may have seen is, before I get to that, I just want to say there's still interesting things that you could do here in this setting. For example, you could still do, even if you weren't very confident in your ability to do natural language processing, you might still do some kind of collaborative filtering, right? And you might infer what one subject would have said on a scenario that they didn't evaluate or that you're hiding the evaluation for based on what other subjects that on other scenarios behaved similarly to this subject said about those scenarios. But so really, I think we want to look at some settings where the features are clearer. Many of you may have seen this website called The Moral Machine was developed at MIT, in which, when you go to that website, you are confronted with basically a modern version of the trolley problem, where the story is that a self-driving car, for some reason, got in the situation, its brakes are failing, and it's about to run over a number of people. The only alternative that it has in this example is that it can choose to swerve and hit a concrete barrier instead. Okay, in which case it won't hit the people on the road. But the story goes that if you hit the people on the road, you will kill them. But if you hit the concrete barrier, you'll kill all the occupants. And then each of these scenarios describes in painful detail who exactly it is that you would be killing. Right, so on the left-hand side, it's a female doctor, a female executive, and so on. And also it points out in this case that the pedestrians are flouting the law by crossing on the red signal, in case that's relevant to you. Okay, and so then you make a choice. Okay, and so here from the red line, I think what I did when I took this, I chose the left option, right? I guess because they were crossing on the red light. I don't know. And so then you go through a whole bunch of these scenarios. Some of them get a little bit surreal. So here is one that I saw where the self-driving car had 3 cats in it, and that was it, which I guess is possible because it's a self-driving car. And on the pedestrian walkway, there are 3 pregnant women. So that was the choice to make. So here you can't see from my outline what I did, but you can probably infer it from my results page. So at the end, you get a results page where it shows, for one, your most saved character, your most killed character, and also some kind of estimate about how much you care about various things, like saving lives, protecting passengers, right? And it does that based on a limited set of scenarios, and surely it doesn't get everything right? I think in particular here for me, it seems to have judged that for me, saving more lives is maximally important, couldn't be more important, which I don't think is quite true. I think that's obviously very important, but I don't think maybe it's it's maximally important that it would rule out anything else. But anyway, in any case, this is kind of the setup that you might have in mind, right? That from these kind of scenarios, you might now be able to predict how much of each of the features of the scenario, like who is on the road, how many people are on the road, how much that matters to your decision. And from that, we can create a model of how one individual would make these decisions, what that person thinks are the right way, is the right way to make that decision. Okay. And then the idea is that if you have models of people this way, then you could use those models to make those decisions in real life self-driving cars. Now, obviously, there are technical limitations potentially, right? It's not clear how a self-driving car is going to know that this one person is a female executive as opposed to having a different profession. So of course, this is, as presented, is unrealistic in a number of ways. One criticism that people have of this is to say that, well, this is not a real problem, right? Self-driving cars are going to encounter this kind of scenario exceedingly rarely, and so we shouldn't hold up progress on self-driving cars just with these kind of extremely rare scenarios that aren't very likely to occur, that maybe we can't even model precisely, while meanwhile they could be saving all these lives. And I think while that's true at some level, I don't think it's limited to these extreme scenarios. So here, just to illustrate that, here's a slide or an image I got from Anka Dragan, who works on self-driving cars. And in this paper that I'm citing here, they considered this problem that their self-driving cars, they faced this problem when they tried to merge onto the highway, right? So they're coming onto the highway. At this point, they had to merge into traffic, right? So they have to somehow go off to the left and join the traffic on the highway. If they didn't, then they would just go off at the next exit again, which wasn't the idea. And what they found was if the car straightforwardly predicted where the other vehicles were going to be, right, that they just kept moving at the same speed, their cars would never merge into traffic. It turns out that in these driving conditions, at least, you had to be a little bit aggressive to merge. You had to kind of get in front of somebody and just expect them to slow down and not keep going at the same speed, in which case they would hit you, because that's just the way that you drive around there. And that kind of tells you that anything you do still has risks involved for everybody, right? It could be that that person that you're merging in front of is not paying attention, and so you place them at very minor, but at some risk of an accident. And so you have to trade off between that and actually getting to where you want to go. So even though I think the extreme trolley scenarios aren't really going to happen, or certainly not very often, this kind of scenario I think is going to happen very often with self-driving car, that they have to make these little decisions that trade off minor risks to others on the road and risks to the occupant of that car with the objective of actually getting the occupant of the car to where they need to go. So it still needs to make those kind of trade-offs, and those trade-offs are similar in nature, still of an ethical nature, as the ones that we saw before. They're not as cleanly specified, and I think in a way, I mean, the trolley scenarios are easier for people to get their heads around because they don't involve probabilities, right? Whereas here in this kind of merging problem, you have to think about all kinds of tiny probabilities, which is probably actually hard for people to do, right? And so my sense is that we want people to evaluate how good or bad the outcome is. We don't really want them to learn probabilistic reasoning for them. That's something that our algorithms are actually very good at doing. Okay, still you might have many concerns with this machine learning approach, and I think if you do, that's good. We want to be skeptical of these things. So there are a number of issues to deal with. One issue is we might predict that people will disagree, right? We might have modeled multiple people very precisely, and just we know that they make different judgments. And so whose judgments should we go with? And really what we want to probably do is to aggregate these judgments and come to some kind of societal consensus, right? And this actually is the field of social choice theory. Social choice theory is about how do you make decisions based on the preferences or other information of multiple individuals. Here you can see our handbook of computational social choice. Computational social choice is actually a big research area within artificial intelligence. Another concern that you might have is that this machine learning approach will at best result in human level decision making, right? We're just trying to replicate what humans are doing. So, if we're doing well, then that's the level of moral decision making that we're at. And you may not be satisfied with that. You might say, well, humans are not all that good, right? And so we would actually like to do better. So that's a fair concern. And to some extent, you will be limited here by what people do. Though at least I think there's a hope of doing a little bit better. Because if you think that, like, let's say I have my own idiosyncratic moral failings. There are some cases where I morally make the wrong decision. But if they're idiosyncratic enough, then maybe you don't make that mistake. But maybe you make a different mistake. And a third person makes a different mistake yet again. So if all our mistakes are pretty rare, then at least we could vote out those errors, right? So I might make the wrong decision, but two other people make the right decision. And so my decision is voted out. So that's maybe one sense in which we could still do better than the moral decision making of one individual human being, though it's certainly true that we'd be stuck at kind of collectively what human beings can do. And then there are more typical machine learning issues, such as how to generalize appropriately to new cases, how we should represent these kind of models that we make of people. So the voting question in particular, so this idea that we're going to make models of different people and then let those models in some sense vote about what the right thing to do is, right? That's really the idea. We make a model of multiple individuals. Then in theory, you could think of like deploying this on a self-driving car if it ever gets in a difficult situation, or even maybe a not so more typical situation such as merging. When it makes a decision, it quickly has those models vote over what the right thing to do is. This is an idea that's appeared multiple times in the literature, different variants of it as well. I'm not going to read you through this long slide with lots of text, but I just wanted to put it up there in case you want to pause it and read through it or look at the references. And so the next thing that I'll do is talk about our own work in a slightly different context, so not self-driving cars, but kidney exchanges. As you can see from my change in outfit, I take a break every once in a while. I hope you do as well. So this is joint work with Rachel Friedman, who at the time was an undergraduate at Duke and is now a PhD student at Berkeley. Jana and Walter I already introduced, and John Dickerson is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland who works on kidney exchanges. So before I get into what a kidney exchange is, which I'm not assuming you already know, first I want to talk briefly about why should AI ever make decisions with a moral component anyway, right? Why can't we just always call in a human being whenever such a decision is about to be made? And I think there are a couple of reasons, and we discussed this in this paper as well. So one reason could be one of speed. If you imagine a self-driving car that is really in one of these trolley type scenarios where it's about to run over a couple of people or must kill its occupants, you don't have time to call in a human being and inform them about the situation. The decision has to be made right away. So that might be one issue, one of speed. Another one that I can think of is one of scale. You might imagine, for example, if you think about the context of online advertisements, we may want to show many advertisements to many people all the time. And now imagine that you were concerned that in certain cases, the combination of an advertisement and a person, it would be unethical, it would be ethically wrong to show that person that advertisement. And so you need to make a judgment. And so then maybe in principle, you could call in a person every single time. But that probably wouldn't scale because you have so many of these advertisements to show. So maybe you want AI to be able to make these judgments on its own. And sometimes it's a little bit of both, right? If we think about the self-driving cars again, maybe not these emergency scenarios, but just the more common scenarios of, should I merge? Should I push my way into traffic? In those kind of cases, well, you might in principle let people do this, right? In fact, that's what we're doing right now. Humans are drivers. And so we make these decisions all the time. And maybe you could imagine some other possibility, right? Maybe what you could imagine that every car would be teller-operated, that somebody is remotely steering the car, if you had very reliable networks, maybe. Right? In principle, you could do that. But now maybe there's this issue of scale again, right? Because, of course, one of the reasons that people pursue self-driving cars, we usually talk about safety and we hope that they will be safer than human drivers. But of course, there's also the cost of human drivers, right? That's a lot of human effort that's being put in. It's a lot of people that you wouldn't have to have on the payroll anymore if this could be done automatically, right? So here we could go into a long talk about technological unemployment. Will AI put people out of work? And will that happen broadly or more narrowly in certain industries? Very interesting topic. I'd be happy to talk about that more some other time, but I'm not going to get into that now. But so anyway, those are two different reasons. I think there's a third, and that's really what this paper is about. So if you think about search problems in AI, right, in particular, think about some kind of combinatorial optimization problem where you have an extremely large search space. That's where we often like to use AI. But if the solution that you pick in the search space, if there is a moral component to that, then that becomes very hard to hand off to a person, right? We rely on the AI algorithm to search through the search space, and it needs some guidance as to what are actually good solutions. So if the objective isn't clear, it's not clear how the AI system can search through the search space. And that's, again, the kidney exchange example is going to be an example of that, because that's why AI is being used here. Okay, so let me get into what kidney exchanges are. So first of all, kidney exchanges are about kidney transplants. So sometimes somebody's kidneys are failing, and they would benefit from a kidney transplant. One way that you might get a kidney transplant is from an organ donor. Right? So if somebody is an organ donor and maybe they die in a car accident, it's very unfortunate, but maybe we can save the kidneys and give them to somebody who needs them. Unfortunately, there are not enough of those kidneys. Another option is to get a live transplant, because a human being has two kidneys. If they're both functioning well, you can donate one and still lead a healthy life. So this is almost where kidney exchanges come in. So first of all, you might find somebody who is willing to give you one of their kidneys if you were ever in need of a kidney. Now, one thing that might happen is that you are not medically compatible, right? Perhaps due to blood type, you actually cannot take the kidney from the willing donor. And so you might imagine, well, that's kind of it. You have to start from scratch. You thank the person for being willing to donate, and now you find somebody else. But there is actually something else that you might be able to do, because it's possible that somebody else is in the exact same situation, but you could actually swap donors, and that would make everything compatible. So let's see that on the slide. First of all, by the way, here is a high-level overview article in Quartz about the role of AI in organ donation and kidney exchanges specifically. Also talking a little bit about our work, but also about a lot of other work on AI and kidney exchanges. But here's the picture that illustrates what I just said. So here we have a son and a wife who each need a kidney. And the mother of the son is willing to donate to the son, and the husband of the wife is willing to donate to the wife. But they're not compatible in each case. Right? So you see that each of these edges, each of these arrows is crossed out, meaning they're not compatible. But it so turns out that the mother on the left is compatible with the wife on the right, and the husband on the right is compatible with the son on the left. And so they can simply swap. Okay. And now, while in most countries it's not allowed, it's illegal to buy and sell kidneys. It's also illegal to give valuable consideration for a kidney. Right. So what I cannot do is I cannot say, well, if you give my wife a kidney, I will give you a job. That is illegal too. But swapping kidneys for kidneys is considered okay. Good. So this is a nice solution. So where does AI come into this? So let's think a little bit more abstractly first about this problem. So here we see the same kind of thing represented as a graph. So what we do in this graph that you see here on the screen is that we take a donor and a patient that belong together, right? So they belong together if the donor wants to give on behalf of that patient, right? So the mother wanted to give on behalf of her son. So the two of them are together in one vertex. And then we draw an arrow if one of the nodes can give to the other nodes, right? So the donor from the one node can give to the patient of the other node. Okay. And then the letters that you see in parentheses, those are blood types, let's say. Right, so here donor 1 has blood type A, and so on. Good. So here we actually see an example with 3 pairs. Okay, and if you think about this example for a second, what you see is that, first of all, what we're looking for now is a cycle. One thing that we can do is we can match donor 1 with patient 2 and donor 2 with patient 1. See that? Okay, and that would work. Everybody would be compatible. That's what those edges indicate. But then donor 3 and patient 3 are left out. So patient 3 does not get a kidney. Another option is to do the same thing on the right. The whole example is perfectly symmetric, so we could leave out donor 1 and patient 1. So we have to make a choice. And now imagine that in general, this graph is going to get much larger, right? If we run a large kidney exchange, we won't have just 3 donor-patient pairs, but we will have lots of them. And this graph will get very complicated. And what you would like to do is find, in some sense, the best way to match everybody together, right? Maybe what you want to do is you want to maximize the number of patients that receive a kidney. And that actually turns out to be a hard optimization problem. It's NP hard. And that's where AI has come into kidney exchanges, right? So actually, algorithms developed in the AI community are now running some of these kidney exchanges in terms of determining who gets matched to whom. Let's look at another example on the next slide. So here we have an example with 4 vertices and lots of compatibilities. So take a look at this and think about what you might do. So it turns out here you have kind of 2 options. One option is to do a 2-cycle, right? So a cycle of length 2, meaning you can match donor 1 with patient 2 and donor 2 with patient 1. And once you do that, there's nothing else you can do. Okay, so then we've given a kidney to 2 patients. Another possibility, though, is to use a 3-cycle. How does that work? In that case, what you would do is you would let donor 2 give to patient 4, donor 4 to patient 3, and donor 3 to patient 2. Okay, see how that works? So those 3 vertices on the right will all be made happy by that arrangement. And then the first vertex, unfortunately, is left out. So 2 possibilities, 2 options there. But the second one matches more patients. Good. Okay, so that's the basic idea of kidney exchange. There's a lot more complexity to it, a lot of questions of, first of all, the reason that they become hard is that you don't want to have arbitrarily long cycles for logistical reasons, because all these operations have to be done at the same time. And also for kind of risk reasons that one of these edges might at the end fall apart and then the whole cycle disappears. So typically there's a limit on how long of cycles you want to consider. And this is a very rich problem that you could take into account more and more aspects. You could also take into account that the fact that if you don't give somebody a kidney right now, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll never get one. Maybe they'll get one in the next round. So you could start thinking about that. This is a very rich research area, but I'm going to focus here on the simpler problem where we just think about matching once. Okay. And the question I want to consider here is, so far I've talked about trying to maximize the number of patients that receive a kidney. And that seems to make sense. But you might wonder whether there are other things that you might consider. Would you ever be willing to prioritize one patient over another? For example, let's suppose that we have these 2 patients, right, that we have to make a choice between. You could look at this example on this slide here. It might be patient 1 and patient 3, right? So here we already figured out we either use the 2-cycle on the left or the 2-cycle on the right. So patient 2 is going to get matched anyway, but the question is patient 1 or patient 3. We could toss a coin, of course. But alternatively, we might consider some facts about the patients. Imagine that patient 1 is a Black student athlete, 20 years old, has her whole life ahead of her. And patient 3 maybe is a 65-year-old man with 3 children, and maybe somewhat of a criminal record, and some other health issues. Okay, would any of that make you prefer one to the other? It's kind of an uncomfortable question, right? And probably you have the immediate reaction that maybe some of these features you should not take into account in this kind of situation. But maybe some of them you would be willing to. So that's kind of the question, right? And in this work, we only considered tie breaking like we do on this slide. So we said, okay, we're not going to change. We're always going to maximize the number of patients that are matched. The only thing we're thinking about is these kind of tie breaking scenarios where there are multiple ways to match the maximum number of patients. And in which case we need to figure out which one we pick. Right? And so what would you be willing to take into account in making that decision? And so in particular on the next slide here, at least as far as this paper is concerned, we would always pick the 3 cycle. We're always going to, first of all, maximize the number of patients that are matched. In principle, you could be willing to deviate from that as well. There might be situations where you might prefer to pick the smaller cycle, but we're not going to consider that here. So what are people willing to take into account? And to figure this out, we went to Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we asked Mechanical Turkers about their opinions. And in particular, we asked them to provide features or attributes of patients that they felt should or should not be taken into account. Okay. And the result of that was there were some features that they were consistently willing to take into account. One of them was age, so the age of the patient. One of them was kind of behavioral health issues, such as whether this person drinks or smokes. And another one was other health issues. Maybe this person has cancer in remission or something like that. Those were the ones that got the most support, that the MTurkers seemed to be in favor of including in the decision. Then there were some that were a little bit unclear, that some MTurkers thought that this you should take into account, and some thought that you shouldn't take it into account. So an example of that was whether the person had dependents, like small children that relied on them. Some MTurkers said you should not take that into account. Some said you should take that into account. So that was a little bit ambiguous. And then there were many things that everybody, or almost everybody, agreed that you shouldn't take into account, such as the person's race. Okay, so what we did is we took at that point the uncontroversial features that should be included according to the MTurkers, specifically age, behavioral health, and other health issues. And then what we wanted to know is we wanted to figure out how much MTurkers would weigh these different characteristics. So we came up with some fictional patient profiles. We came up actually with 8 different ones because we varied 2 attributes we varied 3 attributes with 2 options each, right? So that gives 2 to the 3 different options of how you construct an imagined patient. So in particular, we had some imagined patients that were 30 years old and some that were 70 years old. We had some that drank 1 alcoholic drink per month and some that drank 5 per day. And then we had some that had no other major health problems and some that had skin cancer in remission, right? And so every combination of these would be 1 profile, right? Not corresponding to a real person, but 1 possibility, right? So some were young, rarely drank, and had skin cancer in remission. And then we asked the Mechanical Turkers in pairs of these profiles to choose between them. The next slide shows how often each of these profiles was preferred to another profile. Right? So here at the top, we see the young, rarely drinking, healthy patient, YRH, was the most preferred, somewhat unsurprisingly, right? And so you go down, and so you see that age seems to make the difference. Age makes the biggest difference, but together, right? If you look at the 4th and 5th row, you see that people still preferred the 70-year-old that drank rarely and didn't have cancer in remission to the young patient that frequently drank and had cancer in remission more often. So good. So from this, we wanted to get to weights on the patient, because I'm not going to go into the details of how the algorithm for matching works, but it needs weights on the patients, or weights on the vertices. And to get those weights, we used what's known as the Bradley-Terry model. So we estimated, it's a statistical model that tries to predict who the Mechanical Turkers will prefer in a pairwise combination. And the score, right? So in this model, there is a score for every profile. And the idea of the model is that, according to the model, the probability that 1 profile will be selected over another is proportional to the score of that profile. And that's how that model works. And then you can estimate what these scores are. And then our idea is we're going to use those estimated scores as the weights in our matching algorithm. Again, only the weights for the tie-breaking match. Right? So first we figure out what the optimal number of vertices is that we can match. the maximum number. We take it then as a constraint that you should match that number of vertices. And then to break ties, we try to maximize the weight of the chosen vertices. Okay, and so you see here the young, rarely drinking, healthy patient, of course, has the largest weight, and then it goes down. There are two columns here. The left column, we estimate every number separately. The right column, we assume that everything is linear in the attributes. We're going to focus on the left column here. It doesn't really matter much. Good. And so one thing to keep in mind here is that this might look a little bit funny, because what do the numbers really mean? Right? You see that the top ranked profile has a weight that's more than 4 times the weight of the next ranked profile. And intuitively, that does not mean that we consider that profile, a patient of that profile, 4 times more important than the next one, right? It just means that the statistical model is very confident that the first one will be preferred to the second one. Now, it turns out actually it doesn't really matter that much from the perspective of the experiments that we do later, what exactly the relative weights are. All that really turns out to matter is the order in which these profiles appear. And we'll see that in a second. So here is what happens. So let's look at this figure. So on the x-axis here, you see the different possible profiles with the young, rarely drinking, healthy patient on the left side and so on. Okay. And then on the y-axis, you see how often they were matched. And you see this for 2 different versions of the algorithm. One is the standard algorithm, which actually doesn't pay attention to these profiles at all. That just tries to maximize the number of matches. Right? And so unsurprisingly, what you see in kind of the gray boxes, it doesn't really vary by profile, which is not surprising because the algorithm doesn't even look at it. So the interesting one is the black one, where we do the prioritization. Again, just tie breaking, right? But as you can see, now the profiles that are further to the left, which are generally the more preferred ones by the MTurkers, get matched more often. And that's, it's not too surprising, right? That's what we're doing after all. We're prioritizing some. But you see the effect can be quite big. And it's also interesting that the effect seems to flatten out if you go to the right, right? So after some point, it seems to not really matter that much anymore, right? After about the 4th or 5th profile from left to right, it flattens out. So why is that? We were interested in why that was happening and whether that gave us some insight into what is happening at large in the kidney exchange. Before we get into that, I want to get back to this issue of weights and remember that one weight was 4 times as large as the other one. And so you might rescale the weights and say, well, we're just going to put them all close to each other. And it turns out to make almost no difference to the experiment whatsoever. That's what this slide here shows. So it's really mostly about the ranking that the MTurkers give. Okay, so now back to, I want to especially explain what's going on with the flattening at the end. And to understand that, first we want to understand a little bit more about how kidney exchanges work in the large. As they get big, what tends to happen? And what turns out to happen is that whether you get matched or not is determined in large part by the blood type of both the patient and the donor in the vertex, in the pair, right? And they can be sorted into various categories. So some pairs, right? So some of these vertices are really hard to match because, for example, they may contain a patient that has a universal donor blood type, which actually makes it difficult to give to that patient. Or they might have a donor that is a universal recipient blood type. And so that would also make it hard to match, or maybe even both, which would make it even harder to match them. So these are the pairs that are generally going to have trouble getting matched in the exchange. The opposite of that is over-demanded pairs, right? So they have a universal recipient patient or a universal donor. So that makes it much easier to match them. And intuitively, what's going on there is this is the kind of pair that we wish there were more of in the kidney exchange, right? Because the more of them there are, probably the more other people we can also help by pairing them together. Then there are also the self-demanded pairs that so maybe they both have blood type A. There are other reasons that they could be incompatible besides blood type. So that may be why they turn up to the exchange in the first place. And then also reciprocally demanded, which is the example we saw before, where one of them has blood type A and the other one has blood type B. And intuitively what happens as the market gets large, all the green categories here, over-demanded, self-demanded, and reciprocally demanded, are going to be basically fine. Most of them are going to get matched. And it's the under-demanded ones that are difficult to match. And so what turns out to happen is our prioritization for tie breaking turns out not to really matter for these green categories, but it really matters for the under-demanded category. Because if we zoom in on that, so we have the same kind of figure here, but only looking at the under-demanded profiles. And again, the gray boxes it's pretty flat because it's not even looking at the profile. But what you see now for the black boxes, the prioritized algorithm, is that it starts out high, right? So the young, rarely drinking, healthy patients now really get prioritized, and so they're much more likely to be matched than under the standard algorithm. But the price for that you pay is that as you go to lower ranked profiles, at some point by the fifth profile, it's basically zero chance that you get matched. Okay. And in hindsight, maybe that's not too surprising, but I think that's an interesting takeaway that because I think many people intuitively have a problem with this, right? That it feels uncomfortable to say that, well, now we're going to say that some patients, some donor-patient pairs basically have zero chance of getting matched, whereas the standard algorithm would still give them a shot, right? And so is that something that we're comfortable with? Do we feel that this is the right thing to do? Now, this is the kind of question that I don't think AI researchers should try to answer by themselves, right? This is where we need to get the input of other people, of ethicists, and so on. But it is our responsibility to point out these kind of features, right? That this is what happens if you do this kind of prioritization, and then we need to decide whether that's the thing that we actually want to do or not. So that's the kind of the broader point here. Good. So that you can think of, here's the slide that we already saw before, as another concern with the machine learning approach that we may, and this is maybe also a concern with other approaches, right? That we think maybe about a lot of these decisions kind of locally, right? Like this patient or that patient, right? This outcome for the self-driving car or that outcome. But we also should be thinking about the system-wide effects, right? That as you make these decisions locally in various ways, there will be an effect to the larger system, right? Also, as people respond to the incentives that creates, maybe in driving, right? Maybe if self-driving cars are always cautious, then human drivers will always cut them off. Who knows, right? But this, I think, is generally a difficult question that it's easy to look at these decisions locally, but there's a bigger question of what will happen to the system as a whole. So before we go on, actually, let me take one step back and talk a little bit more about the kidney exchange work that we've done. So first of all, I want to emphasize that this is not, none of this is actually deployed at this point, right? And there are good reasons for that. That first of all, probably you don't want to just ask mechanical Turkers, right? It doesn't seem like that's the ideal body of people to get these answers from. Maybe you want to actually involve people with a medical background, or people who are involved as patients, or other kinds of stakeholders, right? Or a representative sample of the population. It's not entirely clear what the set of people is that you want to ask, and that's an interesting question in and of itself. But presumably it's not mechanical Turkers. And also the kinds of questions we asked them were very restricted. In particular, we only ever asked about 30-year-olds and 70-year-olds. And of course, in reality, there would be many ages in between, and we would need to make decisions about them as well. So this is still a couple of steps short of reality, but I still really like this work because I think we did really do it from beginning to end, right? And we did all of it in simulations, and they're very good simulators for kidney exchanges. But I think it gives a pretty good picture of what would actually happen, right? And I think this basic takeaway also that the under-demanded patient-donor pairs, that those would be the ones most impacted, that conclusion, I think, will hold up even if you do this in a more detailed and complete way. So that's what I like about it. I think this idea of making models of people and having them vote, of course, also came up in the context of self-driving vehicles with the moral machine data. That was the Nutigatu et al. Paper that I cited before from Ariel Prokacha's lab. And I think that's really nice work. But the MIT moral machine data, I don't think was intended for this purpose, right? And I think there's some disagreement among members of that team as to whether that kind of data should be used in this kind of way that I'm presenting here. But I still think, research-wise, I think that's a great paper. And I also want to point out, actually, that another paper that I cited before by Kang et al. That introduced the term virtual democracy is also connected to Ariel Prokacha's group's work on food rescue. So another application of this work, and that is more real, is in food rescue in Pittsburgh. They have tried to figure out how to use these kind of techniques to decide when a food donation comes in, which entity gets it, which potential recipient gets that food donation. So that is very real. Good. So I encourage you to check out those pieces of work. Now, what I want to do in the remainder of kind of this half of the tutorial is talk about a couple of other research topics and papers that look at this one way or the other, right? And this could be thought of in the context of kidney exchange. We've been thinking a lot in the context of kidney exchange, but many of these insights would also hold for self-driving vehicles or food donation or what have you. So first, how can you kind of model this more formally if you like to do kind of theoretical machine learning work? This is a nice paper, I think, to think about that. That also ties to the social choice aspects of things. And in particular, one kind of question that you might ask yourself is, well, we want to ask subjects all these queries, right? Do you prefer this patient to that patient to receive a kidney? Or which one should we prioritize? Or which course of action should the self-driving car take? But how many agents really should you query? And how many queries should you ask of each of them? Right? That's the question that we're looking at now. And in general, you would like to be able to get away with as few of these in both cases as possible, right? If you have to recruit subjects and they're expensive, it's expensive to keep them around longer. So maybe you want to ask them a few queries, but especially maybe you want to have fewer agents, fewer subjects that you have to ask queries, because maybe at some point you run out of subjects. So how do you model this sensibly? And so let's look at this from a little bit of a machine learning perspective. So the data that in the end we're trying to aggregate looks something like the data in this table over here, where each row is a response by a person, a subject, a human subject, to a scenario. So in the leftmost column, we see the subject that's being asked a question. And then the next few columns, indicated by X, are features of the comparison. Right. So here, for example, I said the feature X1 corresponds to whether the patient on the left is younger, if we're comparing patients. Okay. And then the label Y is which one of the two options the agent preferred. So let's say it's 1 if the subject preferred the patient on the left. Okay. And so then for each subject, we have some number of queries that they answered. And so now what we want to do is model and analyze these responses. But you could do this in multiple ways. First of all, and so the approach that I had described before at a high level was that we're going to make a model of every single individual, right? And if we're looking, for example, let's say that our hypothesis space is one of conjunctions of variables. So here, you can actually find a conjunction that fits each individual perfectly. So the conjunction of just X1 explains exactly all of Alice's responses to the queries. Okay, see that? And so that works for each one of these. But now we have 3 different conjunctions. And so we need to somehow aggregate those then, right? Because these are not consistent with each other. Different people answer in different ways. And in the end, our system needs to make one decision. What you could also do is forget about the individual. So kind of forget about the first column altogether and try to come up with a single hypothesis, a single conjunction that fits all of these data, regardless of the agent, the subject that's responding. And you can do that here, making 2 mistakes. So nothing is going to fit perfectly, but if you just use X1, you're going to make 2 mistakes on this particular training data. And so you might just want to go with that. So this is, I think, kind of interesting. And by the way, in the kidney exchange work, we actually did something that was more like the second thing. We actually removed the data of which subject had given which response when we came up with that Bradley-Terry model, the Bradley-Terry model parameters for our data. But neither one of these is completely perfect, I think, right? Because the second approach kind of forgets about who is giving the responses, which would seem to be relevant to some extent. But the first approach maybe is also a little bit excessive, that we try to model everybody perfectly. But in general, maybe we're much less certain about one subject, how to model that subject, than another subject. In which case, should we really just come up with one single model for that first subject and have it count just as much as the second subject that we're much more sure about? It's not entirely clear. And so this paper came up with a little bit more abstract model to deal with this. So this is the model that we have. And if you're familiar with the computational social choice literature, you'll probably recognize some of this as being very closely related to the maximum likelihood approach to social choice. And if you don't know what that is, that's fine. But so here's the idea. We imagine that there is a correct concept that we wish to learn, right? So this is really maybe the right way to prioritize one patient over another. And we assume that we cannot directly observe this. On top of that, we assume that each individual human subject has a concept as well, right? So they have a concept, meaning it's a way in which they choose to prefer one subject over another, right? Like the conjunctions that we saw before. And we assume that these are noisy versions of the correct concept, right? So without getting into the philosophical commitments, but the idea here is that we imagine that there is an ethically correct way to make these decisions, and human subjects are kind of approaching that, right? So they most of the time get it right, but each one of them maybe has some systematic errors that they make, right? Like there are some things that I haven't understood about ethics, and so there I am consistently making a certain kind of mistake relative to the correct concept. That's the idea. Okay, and then the way we model this is that then we're presenting a particular example to agent J, and then that example, the features of that example combined with the noisy concept that agent J has, result in a label that agent J gives to this example. Yes? Okay, so that's the idea. And then our goal is to estimate the correct concept. And now within the PAC framework, we can now start formally thinking about how many samples you would need to see in order to be reasonably sure that you have the correct concept. And more specifically, we can talk both about how many agents you would need and how many queries per agent you would need. And this is the kind of theorem that results. I don't want to take you through this detailed theorem in full detail, but what I want to point out is that, so here you have a specific concept class written at the bottom, and some conditions that need to hold. And near the bottom, you can see that then you can prove guarantees about how many agents and how many data points per agent you need in order to be able to output the correct hypothesis with high probability. Okay. Good. Okay. Again, I'm just going through a couple of different topics here. So the previous one, by the way, was with Hanrui Zhang, who's a PhD student here at Duke, who's doing absolutely amazing work. And this next one is a more behavioral concern. Right? So far, we've been taking the responses that the subjects have been giving as truth, right? As maybe we modeled them as noisy versions of the correct concept, but we assume that the subjects are somehow consistent and don't have behavioral biases. And of course, in reality, human subjects have behavioral biases. And that's the kind of thing that we tried to explore in this paper. So this is with Lak Chan, who is a postdoc at Duke. Kenzie was at Duke and is now a psychology PhD student at the University of Oregon. Duncan is John's student at the University of Maryland, and everybody else you know. Great. And so here what we were considering is that from some of the psychology literature, we got this idea that there is a concern that if the subjects learn something about what they think the AI thinks about them, right? So if they get some feedback that suggests that the AI has modeled them in a particular way, then they might incorporate this into their model of themselves and also in their responses going forward. So specifically what we looked at is, here's what we did. So we did an intervention where we would tell subjects that after responding to some queries that according to the AI, they cared more about the life expectancy of the patients than about how many dependents they have. Right. So this was in a context where they were answering queries that involved both of those features, unlike the experiments before, in making the decision. And in fact, this feedback that we gave them was deceptive in the sense that we just gave them random feedback. We randomly chose what feedback they got, whether we said that the AI thought that they cared more about the life expectancy, or that the AI thought that they cared more about dependence that the patient had. Right. So that feedback was actually random, which allows this to be a controlled study. And then we looked at, in subsequent queries, did they then tend to favor the patient that had higher life expectancy relative to the patient that had more dependence? And we saw that, in fact, there was some effect. It was sort of on the border of whether it was significant or not. But you see that if they got the feedback, so that the life bar here, right? So you have control, that's the red one. Life is where they get the feedback that they care more about the life expectancy. And the y-axis then is how often they preferred the subject that had, the patient that had higher life expectancy. And so you see that there seems to be an effect that when they're told that they care more about life expectancy, in fact, from that point on, they do start caring a little bit more about life expectancy. And that's not an effect that we want. We want them to give true responses. We don't want them to be influenced by what they think the AI thinks about them. And we did another experiment. So this looks kind of concerning, but as I said, it's on the boundary of significant. We did another one where we repeated the same thing, and now we got p equals 0.15. But we also had a condition where we said that, well, it's not AI that has this model of you. We said, according to expert psychologists, you care more about the life expectancy of the patients than about how many dependents they have, right? Again, as before, this was just a random feedback so that we could track the result and that it wasn't correlated with their actual responses before. And we see that the effect for saying that it's expert psychologists judging this, is much stronger still. So the takeaway of that is that I think this is something to worry about. It would be much worse if it was actual people that were making these judgments, right? So if they thought that people were making these judgments about them, somehow that has a much stronger effect than when they think that AI is making these judgments about them. But still something to take into account, that we can't necessarily take all these responses at face value. We have to worry about behavioral biases. Very briefly, I'll mention another paper here at AAAI. So hopefully you can take a look at that paper, where there's a slight addition where in many of these comparisons, some subjects are just not comfortable, right? As you can imagine, if you're confronted with one of these self-driving car trolley problems, or maybe also some of the kidney situations, right? So some of those comparisons, you might not be comfortable saying choose one or the other, right? And this is a concern, especially with like the moral machine. Anybody can go there, but you can also just stop, right? And I mean, the same thing is true for the mechanical Turkers. They can always just walk away from the experiment. And so that's also a concern because then we get bias in our data. So what we did here is we added an option, which is to flip a coin. So now if you're a subject, you can choose patient A, you can choose patient B, but you can also flip a coin. Say, well, I can't decide between these two. Just flip a coin to decide who gets it. And maybe in some ways that sometimes feels more fair. And since that makes subjects more comfortable, we think that that says something about how they actually judge these scenarios. And so it should at some level be taken into account. But this also requires that if we want to then take this data and build a model out of it for how to make decisions by AI, we need to actually think about what it means for subjects to toss a coin. Right. In particular, it could mean different things, right? Maybe, and probably this varies between people as well. Maybe some people say, well, I want to toss a coin when it was close, right? If these two patients are identical, except one of them is 62 years old and the other one is 63 years old, that difference is too small for me. That shouldn't make the difference, so I want to toss a coin. That might be one. But for other subjects, it might be more about incomparability. Right? Maybe other subjects are more inclined to toss a coin, not when the difference is small. Maybe they would still decide clearly one way or the other, even based on small differences. But they want to toss a coin when one feature points in one direction and another feature points in the other direction. For example, maybe they're confronted with a scenario where one patient is much older, but also has more dependence. And at that point, maybe they say, well, those things are pointing in different directions for me in terms of what I value more. So I'm just going to toss a coin. And so we need to be able to model this to actually make the right decisions in our software. So let me not go into this in too much more detail, but that's the basic idea of this work. So in general, I also want to point out that if you're interested in computational social choice, remember the idea of social choice is this is the study of how you make joint decisions based on the preferences or other information of multiple agents. Again, it's a large research body within the AI community and broader as well. And so I think this raises a lot of interesting questions for computational social choice. If you happen to know about judgment aggregation, this in some ways fits within the judgment aggregation work, though it's also a little bit different. And preference elicitation plays a key role here as well. What that means is that subjects don't come and give you their entire model of when you should prefer one patient to another. It's not like they rank all possible patients. All we can do is ask them a few queries about pairs of patients, let's say. But at some point we have to stop, and we probably haven't learned exactly what they would prefer in every single situation. So that plays a fundamental role here, and that needs to be thought about in the aggregation, as we kind of did in the PAC model. And I think this is a truly interdisciplinary topic that should draw on computational social choice, of course, but also machine learning and statistics, as we saw, ethics and philosophy, and the behavioral sciences. Okay, since I have a little bit more time, I want to briefly talk about another line of research that is closely related to this as well, that originally actually had a different motivation. So I'll give you the original motivation, but then I'll also tell you a little bit about how that might relate to. And here, this was called the Crowdsourcing Societal Tradeoffs. This was work with Rupert Freeman, who was a PhD student here at Duke, is now on the faculty at the University of Virginia. Marcus Brill, who was a postdoc here at Duke, and then went on to TU Berlin. Yuchen Li, who was a PhD student here and is now at Google. Han Rui, who I mentioned before, and Yu Cheng was a postdoc here at Duke and is now at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And here are motivating examples were actually more environmental in nature. So we were thinking about pollution and trash, and so we'll see that in a second. And so here's a motivating problem. Imagine that you're a benevolent government and you've decided that, well, old vehicles like the one you see on the right over here are too inefficient in terms of fuel consumption, and we'd like to get them off the road for that reason. But if you think about it, you don't necessarily want to get every single vehicle that isn't the newest possible model off the road, right? If we have a 1-year-old car, that's probably, it's probably not the most efficient anymore, but still pretty efficient. And if you think about just constantly disposing of all these vehicles, that would have its own energy costs and other costs. So that's not necessarily the environmentally friendly thing to do either. So which cars should the government aim to get off the road? And it's difficult because you're trading off different things here, right? Even the energy costs involved in this are not directly comparable, right? Because it's gasoline, but maybe in the process of building the vehicles, you use other kinds of energy sources that maybe have different effects, right? Maybe you care about energy dependence, and gasoline is bad for that, but maybe coal isn't in the US. So here's the basic version of our problem that we want to answer. We basically want to elicit from subjects a trade-off between two things, right? So if we take two things that we both consider bad, such as producing one bag of landfill trash, and another thing is one gallon of gasoline, right? Both of those things we consider bad, right? I mean, it's okay. I mean, I use gasoline. I create landfill trash. We're going to do some of that, but we still like to minimize it. And now we want to figure out what the trade-off should be, because sometimes we face these trade-offs. Even in your own personal life, you face some of these trade-offs, right? That if I want to be a better person, what should I focus on? Should I focus more on driving a smaller vehicle or really avoiding driving a car at all? Or should I focus my efforts more on reducing my landfill trash? And so it'd be very helpful to know a direct trade-off that I can say, well, producing one bag of landfill trash is just as bad as using X gallons of gasoline. And we have to kind of decide on this together, right? We could all make our own trade-off, but that might result in inconsistencies. So, for example, maybe for some reason I decide that gasoline is the thing to worry about. And so I really go through great efforts to avoid using gasoline. So I never take the car anywhere. I never take a taxi or Uber or Lyft or anything. I really, go through great lengths to avoid using any gasoline whatsoever. But meanwhile, I don't worry about landfill trash at all. And I create lots of landfill trash, let's say. I hope I don't in real life. And then maybe meanwhile, there's somebody else out there who has the opposite, who has drawn the opposite conclusion, who is saying, well, landfill trash is really bad. And they really try very hard. They go through great lengths. To avoid creating any landfill trash. But meanwhile, they don't worry about gasoline. And so they drive a huge vehicle, drive it around all the time, create lots of carbon dioxide emissions. And so the result is that actually together we end up doing a lot of polluting activity and also making our lives quite hard. Whereas if we had both set a consistent trade-off, that would in effect have resulted in kind of a deal between us, right? To say that, well, you might imagine that I could have gone up to that other person and say, boy, I really don't like that you're using so much gasoline. And I know you don't like it that I create so much landfill trash. Why don't we make a deal that I'll do less of the one thing and you'll do less of the other thing? And that way we'll both be better off. And maybe we can even ease up on the other activity a little bit. And so we'll both be better off and we'll pollute less in both possible ways, both of us. So that's the idea. And if you had a consistent trade-off that everybody used, then that would basically affect that. And again, also this comes up in the context of maybe you have to set a broader policy. But how should you determine X? And at some level, this is a subjective question, right? If you think about gasoline versus kerosene or something, maybe at that point, it's something, it actually becomes more of a scientific question of the emissions that result from that. But even when you look at something like landfill trash versus gasoline, at some level, it's a subjective decision because they change the environment in different ways. And it's just a question of what we consider to be worse. So one thing that you could do is vote about it. And so the way that you would vote is, and maybe, again, there's a question of who would be the voters here, whether they would be hopefully well-informed citizens or experts. Let me not go into that bit of detail here. But let's say we have these 3 voters, and they each have their own thought about what X should be, right? So 1 gallon of landfill trash should correspond to, 1 bag of landfill trash should correspond to X gallons of gasoline. And the red one says it should be 2, X should be 2. The yellow one says X should be 4, and the blue one says X should be 10. And so what should the outcome be overall, right? You might say we should take the average, but the average is very sensitive to outliers, right? So if somebody says 1 million, that has a big effect on the outcome. And that could also be strategically abused, right? If you don't agree with where everybody else is putting the trade-off, you could shift it basically anywhere by yourself by just saying a crazy enough number. And so in social choice theory, usually we end up preferring the median, right? So here the median is just 4. That's the one that's in the middle, because that is not sensitive to outliers. And in fact, it's strategy proof, meaning that you can't manipulate the outcome in your direction by saying another number. Now, the key technical issue that we faced here was one of consistency. So what does that mean? So suppose now we introduce a third activity. And so we think about deforestation, in fact, clearing forest in square meters. Okay, now the consistency here, now I'm using different types of units here. I grew up in Europe and now I live in the US, so you can see the inconsistency in the types of units I'm using. That's not the kind of consistency I'm talking about. I just want to think about, well, there should also be a trade-off between a square meter of forest cleared and a gallon of gasoline used, right? And so that trade-off might be Y. And then there should be a trade-off between clearing forest and trash produced. And that trade-off should be Z. And now consistency means that Z, the trade-off, right? So how many square meters of forest is equal to 1 bag of trash? That should be equal to Y times X, right? Otherwise, the results that you would get would not be consistent. And the way in which you make the comparisons, the order in which you consider things would start to matter, and that doesn't seem right. But now we get a paradox. So here we have a situation where we have 3 voters that are all individually consistent. Okay. So this voter over here on the left says that clearing 1 square meter of forest is just as bad as using 100 gallons of gasoline. And using 1 gallon of gasoline is as bad as creating 2 bags of landfill trash. And so clearing 1 square meter of forest is as bad as creating 200 bags of landfill trash, according to this person. Right? Numbers are just made up. But you can see it's consistent in that way, right? Because we have that Z equals X times Y relationship. And that's true for the other 2 as well. And now what you might do is you might want to aggregate this so that we have aggregate comparisons between every pair of activities. And so you might want to take the median on each edge. And if you take the median on the forest to gasoline edge, you'll get 200. If you take the median on the gasoline to trash edge, you'll get 2. And the median from forest to trash is 300. But now, look at this. These aggregate comparisons are no longer consistent, right? Because 200 times 2 is not 300, it's 400. So that's interesting that even though each individual voter was consistent, in aggregate, they are not consistent. This is the kind of thing that happens quite frequently in social choice theory. And so a lot of the work that's been done on this topic has been thinking about how should you aggregate this, and also what are good algorithms for finding these aggregate solutions. So that's all I wanted to say about figuring out what the objective function should be for our AI systems. There's a lot more that can be said. There's a much broader literature on value alignment, how to make sure that our AI systems correspond to our human values, including more specific subtopics such as inverse reinforcement learning, where from an agent's actions, we try to infer what objectives it has. Stuart Russell's group, again, has been doing a lot of research there, and I encourage you to check that out. But now I want to switch topics, and I want to focus on these issues that come from the fact that AI agents aren't necessarily like human agents. There might be multiple copies of them running around with basically the same code. And we get these questions about, well, where are the boundaries of one agent, and where they are from the perspective of preferences may not line up with the perspective of beliefs, where the boundaries are from the perspective of beliefs. And this raises a lot of fundamental questions about how you should make decisions and form beliefs in these kind of contexts. And to some extent, these questions aren't new. Many of these types of questions have been considered before in the context of examples in the foundations of belief formation and decision theory. But usually the examples that were involved were considered kind of fanciful, that they weren't very realistic. And they probably weren't really realistic for human beings, at least to some extent. But I would argue that they're more relevant to AI systems. And so this remaining part of this tutorial, the second half, even though at this point we have less than half the time left, is going to focus on those kind of questions. And I'm going to focus mostly on examples and thinking about things conceptually. It will get a little bit technical at some point, but again, the focus will be on thinking about things conceptually. How should we even think about these things? So it'll be a little bit more high level. I hope it will be enjoyable. This is definitely the part where I'm going to ask a lot of questions of you to think about what you would do or how you would form beliefs. And so I really encourage you to, at those points, pause the video and really take a little bit of time for yourself to think about what you think the answer should be. You'll get a lot more out of it that way. So here are some examples. What should you do if you knew that others could read your code? What would that mean in human beings? Well, that might mean that somebody can read what's going on in my brain right now, right? Now, in reality, maybe you don't need direct access to my brain. In practice, often we can try to read another person's face, right? And we might be able to learn something about what they're thinking that way, even when they don't necessarily want to signal that, right? You could think about a poker game where maybe I have a tell, which means that I do something that reveals what I'm thinking, even though I don't really want to reveal what I'm thinking. So that's what that might look like in human beings. But of course, here we're going to be more interested in AI, where it's much more reasonable that somebody might have access to the code of the algorithm. Maybe another algorithm, right? Or another agent might have that have access to that. Another example is, suppose that you knew you were facing somebody that is running the same code as you. What would that look like in human beings? Well, here we have two identical twins, Mark and Scott Kelly, who both became NASA astronauts. So they are in many ways similar and make similar decisions as each other. So maybe that's about the closest that we can get as human beings, right? Maybe when Mark makes a decision, he realizes that Scott is pretty likely to make the same decision, but still a little bit extreme for human beings. Whereas again, with an AI agent, there might be another copy of that agent running the exact same code somewhere else. And one more example has to do with this idea that we can erase data in AI agents, right? And that's not very typical for human beings, but so you can ask this kind of question of, what if you knew that you had been in the exact same situation before, but you can't possibly remember what you did? Now, there are some movie scenarios. You may have seen the movie 50 First Dates, in which the character played by Drew Barrymore every day forgets everything that she did on previous days. But again, this is more the exception than the rule. Of course, we do forget a lot, right? I forget stuff all the time, but it's not systematic enough to be thinking about it in these kind of contexts. Whereas with AI, we might say that, well, when I hand over my self-driving car to somebody else, I want all the data about where I wanted to go, where I went, to be erased. And that might be more systematic. And so the self-driving vehicle itself might realize what it must have forgotten and what it will forget in the future as well. So let's look at some examples. It's a little bit more from the philosophy literature, and we'll talk about some philosophy papers. Hopefully that will be fun. And you may know some of these examples already. Well, in that case, I hope you'll enjoy being reminded of them, but maybe it's your first time, so I'll try to talk through each of them in detail. The first one here is Newcomb's demon. And in this scenario, you're going to face a demon. So that's just to make the story somewhat dramatic. Really what matters is somebody who's very good at predicting what you will do. But we're going to imagine that this entity is extremely good at it, so we'll call it a demon. So the demon earlier got two boxes, A and B, and put a positive amount of money in each of those two boxes. Each one of them will have a positive amount of money. And now you have a choice. And it's maybe not the choice that you would expect. One option is you get the contents of just box B. And the second option is that you get the content of both boxes. This may seem like a silly question because obviously the boxes together will have more money than just the one box. So why is this an interesting problem? Well, there is a twist. And the twist is that the demon first, before putting any money in the boxes, predicted what you would do. And this demon is exceptionally accurate at judging what you're going to do. And then the choice that the demon makes in terms of how much money to put in the boxes depends on the prediction made by the demon. In particular, if the demon predicted that you would only take box B, then the demon is going to put $1 million in box B and $1,000 in box A. However, if the demon predicted that you would take both boxes, then there will be only $1,000 in each. And so now the question is, what would you do? Would you take one box or would you take both boxes? So please take a little while to think of it yourself. And so here are the two intuitions, right? One is simply that, well, in whatever money is in the boxes is already there, right? I can't change that anymore at this point. I'm standing in front of the demon. The money is already there. I don't know what's in there, but whatever's in there is already in there. So I might as well take both boxes. That's one intuition. The other one, though, would suggest that you would only take box B. And one way to think about this is as follows. Suppose that you're not the only one playing this game with the demon. So you are a part of this long line of people that are all playing this game with the demon. And each person in front of you, you see that the demon predicted right. So every person who walks away with only one box walks away with $1 million. And each person that picks both boxes walks away with only $2,000. And so you might say, well, I'd rather be one of those people that walks away with $1 million than be one of those people that walks away with only $2,000. So what I should do is just pick one box, because that would very strongly suggest I'm going to walk away with $1 million. So we have these two conflicting intuitions that both arguments seem pretty sound, but they give opposite prescriptions. Okay, so we're going to come back to all these scenarios in just a little bit, but I'm going to go to a different one now. The prisoner's dilemma. Probably many of you already know what the prisoner's dilemma is, but just for completeness, let me talk through it. I'm not going to talk through the whole story that's usually given with the prisoner's dilemma, but just how the game works. So this is a two-player game. There's a red player and a blue player. And each of these players is going to simultaneously choose to either cooperate or defect. Right? So cooperate with the other player or not be cooperative with the other player. And then, so that means the red player will choose a row and the blue player will choose a column. Once they've each done that, that specifies one entry in this matrix with two numbers in it. And by convention, the first number is the row player, the red player's payoff. And the second number is the blue player, the column player's payoff. Okay. And so now if you analyze this game, you can see, let's say you were the red player, right? Let's say you were the red player. And now you could reason as follows. Well, if the blue player cooperates, I will get a higher utility from defecting, namely 3, than from cooperating, which would be 2. And if the blue player defects, then I would do better defecting, getting 1, than cooperating, getting 0. So no matter what the blue player does, I'm better off defecting. And you can go through the analysis and see that it's the same for the blue player. This is a symmetric game. So both players are better off defecting. That's the typical game theoretic analysis. And the interesting thing about that is that if they both defect, then the payoffs are 1, 1. And they could have both done better by both cooperating. Had they both cooperated, they would have gotten 2, 2, right? And that would be better. Okay. But so the classical analysis says you should defect because no matter what the other player does, you're better off defecting. But now imagine that the other player is very similar to you, right? Imagine that you're playing against your identical twin, and not just any identical twin, but one that you've agreed with on everything since childhood, right? Whenever somebody asks you what flavor ice cream you wanted, you both said at the same time you said strawberry, and every single decision like that, your whole lives has been the same. And so now you have this intuition that says, well, and by the way, I should also say that I'm going to assume here that in spite of having been together your whole lives, you're still selfish. So you only care about how well you do and not how well your twin does. Okay. But now still, even with that specification, you might have this, you might think this way. You might say, well, if I cooperate, my twin is very likely to cooperate as well. So I would get 2. And that's better than if I defect, because then in that case, I think my twin is also going to defect and I end up with 1. And that would be worse. Okay, so again, two conflicting intuitions. One says that we should defect because no matter what the twin does, we'd be better off defecting. And the other one says that, well, if I cooperate, I'm much more likely to walk away with 2. And if I defect, I'm much more likely to walk away with 1. And 2 is better than 1. And does it matter here that you always act the same way, right? Or does this even still work? That second intuition, does that even still work in cases where you almost always agree with your twin? Right? So maybe your whole life, you've almost always said the same thing, but there was this one time when you were 8 years old, somebody asked you what flavor ice cream you wanted, and one of you said strawberry and the other one said chocolate. Everybody was in shock that you said something different, and maybe it never happened again. Is that enough for the second intuition to take over? Okay, we'll come back to this as well. And again, I should emphasize here that the reason we're interested in this is not so much to think about human identical twins as we are to think about AI, right? And that there might be multiple agents that use the exact same code. For example, maybe my copy of Siri or Siri on my phone, right, which is supposed to represent me, is playing some kind of game with Siri on your phone. And they use the exact same code, but maybe they're still acting on each of our own interests. Another example, I'll call this one the lockdown dilemma to kind of go with the spirit of the time. So I hope everybody is doing well. So I don't mean to make fun of anybody's situation. It's a tough time for many people. But many of us are in some form of lockdown, or at least we have various limitations for what we can do right now. And so that's inspiring this little story of a dilemma. And so let's say that the lockdown is very monotonous. It's so monotonous that every day you wake up and you've kind of forgotten what day it is. You've forgotten what happened before. You kind of exist in this blur. But now suppose you do know that the lockdown lasts 2 days overall, a little bit shorter than they really last. And now every morning, your main decision is whether to eat an unhealthy cookie. Okay, there's an unhealthy cookie. This is a fried Oreo cookie. I don't know why anybody would eat that, but let's say you wanted to eat that. And let's say that you had the following utility function. If you eat a cookie, the immediate thing that happens is it tastes good, and so you get 1 unit of utility right away. But then later you get a stomach ache, and that's quite a bit later. So it's going to be the next day and even a little bit later than that. So maybe 25 hours from now. Okay, that's when you get a stomach ache, and that will have a utility of -3. So, should you eat the cookie? Well, you might say it depends on how much I value the future, right? What is my discount factor? Let's say actually, though, that you really discount the future. Right? Maybe, again, you're some sort of mental state that's resulting from the lockdown. You've decided you only care about today. You don't care about tomorrow. Right? So you discount the future very heavily. Maybe you still care about like an hour from now, but you don't care about 25 hours from now. That's too much. Okay. And no, we can argue about whether you should care about the future, but I don't want to argue about that. So let's suppose that we think it's reasonable to care only about today. And in that case, should you eat the cookie right now? And your first intuition might be, well, it seems pretty clear. If I don't care about tomorrow, then of course I should eat the cookie because the -3 will be in the future so far away that I don't really care about it. Whereas the +1 happens right now. But there is still an argument that you can give for not eating the cookie. The reason is that you know that this lockdown lasts 2 days. So there's maybe a 50% chance that today is the second day. Right? Again, you've kind of lost track of which day it is. There's a 50% chance that today is the second day. And now if you choose the cookie, if you choose to eat the cookie, chances are you chose to eat the cookie yesterday as well. And that means that 1 hour from now, you're going to have a big stomach ache, right? And let's say that, an hour from now, you don't discount that much. So you would rather not eat a cookie now and not have a stomach ache than eat a cookie now and then have a stomach ache. Now, of course, you can't really affect anymore whether you're going to have a stomach ache later. That decision you made yesterday, if there was a yesterday. But you can still change your belief about whether you're going to have a stomachache. If you choose to eat a cookie now, chances are you chose the same thing yesterday because you were in the same epistemic situation yesterday. So if you eat a cookie now, you can expect that stomach ache to come. And if you don't eat it, you can expect it not to come. So maybe that's an argument that you shouldn't eat the cookie right now, even if you don't care about tomorrow. So we have these three examples with conflicting intuitions. I hope you've thought a little bit about each of them. I again encourage you to think a little bit more about what you really feel the right thing to do in each of these cases is. But what's going on in each of these examples is that your own choice is evidence for something. In the first example, it's evidence for what the daemon put in the boxes, right? If you know what your own choice is, that tells you something about what's likely to be in the boxes. In the second scenario, what you do is evidence for what your twin does. And in the third scenario, what you do is evidence for what you're likely to do on the other day, which might have been yesterday. And whether you take this evidential effect into account is the difference between two forms of decision theory called evidential decision theory and causal decision theory. So evidential decision theory says that you should take these evidential effects into account when you consider how to make a decision, and when you evaluate some option for that decision. You say, okay, well, how happy do I expect to be conditional on taking that option? And pick the one that maximizes that. And so this would actually tell you you should pick only one box in Newcomb's Demon's problem, because conditional on that, you're going to expect to walk away with $1 million, and so you'll be happier in expectation. Similarly, with your twin, you should cooperate, because then you expect your twin to cooperate as well and be happier as a result. And you should not eat the cookie, because then you expect yourself not to have eaten the cookie on the other day as well, and so you won't have a stomachache. That's evidential decision theory. And it contrasts with causal decision theory, where you say, well, you should only think about, when you figure out what your decision should be, you should only think about what you actually causally affect. Okay? So even though, yes, you would like your twin to cooperate and you would like there to be $1 million in the box, and you would like not to have a stomachache, all those things are true, but you can't affect them anymore. Right? You're not in control of that. Either your twin or your past self or the daemon is in control of that, or was in control of that, and there's no way to change that. So you should just focus on what you can actually affect. So causal decision theory actually would tell you, pick both boxes, defect on your twin, and just eat the cookie. Good. So this is a continuing debate in philosophy and beyond, what the right kind of decision theory is. But again, most people practically thinking about decision theory don't really worry about this too much. Many of them don't even know the difference. But let's say most economic theorists, they usually, if they have an opinion at all, they usually would subscribe to causal decision theory. And in part, that's because these kind of scenarios don't really come up in their full effect in real life, right? Maybe I'm playing prisoner's dilemma with somebody who's pretty similar to me, but it's hard to argue that I can't make a decision that wouldn't also really significantly change my belief about what the other person does. But when we're thinking from the perspective of AI, right, where the code of the other person might be known to be the same as my own, that's very different. So let's think a little bit more about that. So there are many arguments for and against causal decision theory and evidential decision theory. Let me show you one of our own, just to give you some sense of how you might try to make progress on this question. And this is joint work with my PhD student, Kasper Oosterheld. And this work will actually appear in a philosophy journal, so that's nice. So we're going to here have an example in which we argue causal decision theorists kind of make the wrong decision. And in fact, what we're going to show is that they'll become a money pump. That means that we can extract money from causal decision theorists to an unlimited extent. It does require that we're able to predict them very well. So we'll see that in a second. And so the game that we're going to have them play is called the adversarial offer. And it's somewhat reminiscent of the Newcomb's Demon problem, but a little bit different. So we have a daemon. really we don't need a daemon, we just need a pretty good predictor. And this predictor now is going to, again, you're going to get a choice to choose a box, but now it's going to be maybe more like what you would expect, just choosing one box. And the daemon is going to put $3 into each box that it predicted that you wouldn't choose. Okay? If it predicts you don't choose this box, then it puts $3 there, otherwise 0. And now if you want the box, it's going to cost you $1 to open it. Okay? And you can open at most one box. So let's say the daemon's decision is on Sunday, and then on Tuesday, you have to make the decision of which box to open. You're allowed to open neither box as well. Okay. So as you can imagine, I'm going to put something in between that's going to be on Monday. But for now, it's just these two options. And now we say that the daemon is 75% accurate. Okay. And in particular, we're also going to assume that we don't really have access to a pure randomizing device. Right? You might say, well, what's preventing us from just tossing a coin somewhere where the daemon can't see it? And so that would be purely 50-50. We're going to assume, and we at some level have to assume here, that that's not possible. Okay, so 75% of the time, the daemon gets us right. Now, we argue that if you're a causal decision theorist, you have to choose one box, right? Because no matter what belief you form about where the money is, there's going to be at least one box for which you have a 50% or more belief that there's that there's $3 in that box. And so that's a pretty good deal that you should, if you believe that there's at least 50% chance that there's $3 in the box and you're maximizing your expected winnings, you should buy that box, right? Unless you think the other one is even more likely to have it. But in any case, you should buy one box. And the funny thing is that you will do this and you know that you will regret doing this, because you know that in the end, the daemon is 75% accurate, which means that there's only a 25% chance that you walk away with $3. Hence, on average, what you walk away with is 3/4, but you paid $1 for that, so you will regret the whole thing. Right? So that's funny. There's something odd about that. And we can make the example even worse. So now we're going to add the Monday step, where we say, okay, in addition to all of that, we're going to add an opt-out step. And in this opt-out step, the daemon promises, it gives you an option. It says, well, I promise not to make you the adversarial offer later if you pay me 20 cents now. Okay. So now you have a new choice on Monday, which is to pay off the daemon, pay the daemon some money. And if you do, the daemon won't make you an offer on Tuesday. And so our argument says you will do this, right? Because otherwise, in expectation, you expect to lose $0.25. Right? Well, $1 minus the, in expectation, 3/4 that you would walk away with. And so this seems wrong in some sense, right? Now, we've really been able to exploit the causal decision theorist in a very funny way. It's not too surprising that you might consistently lose a game, right? If the other person is better able to assess you, to predict what you're thinking, right? Like I might consistently lose poker games that way. But normally I would have every freedom to say at some point, okay, look, you keep beating me at poker, I'm going to walk away and save my money, right? So I can always refuse to play in this game. And if I can refuse to play the game, then you can't systematically exploit me, right? If I realize that on average I'm going to lose money playing poker against you, and my only concern is to maximize my own expected amount of money, then I will just refuse to play. And so I won't actually lose money. But here in this game, here also, the protagonist, the CDT person, right? The person who adheres to CDT is also free to walk away, right? It's just an offer. The daemon is offering to the person to open a box, but the person has every right not to take it. And in spite of that, still, the causal decision theorist systematically loses money. So that's the sense in which we think that the causal decision theorist is a money pump here, though, of course, it does require that the causal decision theorist can be predicted accurately. Okay, so that's it for decision theory for now, but we'll come back to it. And now I want to focus on the concept of imperfect recall. Imperfect recall is a concept in game theory, but it just means that you forget something that you knew before. Again, I forget stuff all the time, but here typically what we have in mind is that you systematically forget something, so that we know how that happens, right? And again, this is relevant to AI systems, I think, because often maybe we want them to forget, right? If I hand off my self-driving car, I want it not to keep the data around of what I did with it, maybe. And actually, imperfect recall is already used in a couple of places in AI, in particular in poker playing AI. Though there, it's actually used more for scalability, right? It's easier to scale certain methods if you allow the AI system to forget some things. But it turns out some things in decision theory, but even in belief formation, get pretty weird. And the canonical example of that is what's known as the Sleeping Beauty problem. So this is a fun one, I think. This is a great problem to mention to friends at a cocktail party, maybe a kind of academic cocktail party, right? But you can have a lot of fun with this one. And here's how it goes. So it's a story. And in the story, there is a participant in a study, an experimental study, let's say at a university campus, and we're going to call the participant Sleeping Beauty. The reason will be clear soon. And the rules of the experiment are as follows. On Sunday, the experimenter is going to give her some drugs that will make her fall asleep. After she falls asleep, the experimenter is going to toss a coin, heads or tails. Okay? Fair coin, 50-50. And if the coin lands heads, then she is awoken on Monday. She'll get to be awake for a little while. And then the experimenter is going to give her the same cocktail of drugs again that will make her sleep again. And he is going to let her sleep through all of Tuesday. Whereas if the coin lands tails, then also he will wake her up on Monday. She'll be awake for a little while. She'll get the cocktail of drugs again. She'll fall asleep again. But this time she'll also be awoken on Tuesday. Okay? So the only difference between heads and tails is whether she's also awoken on Tuesday. And on the right, you can see that a little diagram that indicates that, right? So Sunday, the coin is tossed. If it's heads, she wakes up only on Monday. If it's tails, she wakes up on both days. Those are the rules of the experiment. And then Wednesday, she's woken up. But let's say she's woken up in a different room. It will be clear that it's Wednesday. So we don't really need to worry about Wednesday. We'll only be interested in Monday and Tuesday. And now the key thing here, and this is where the imperfect recall comes in, is that because of all these drugs, whenever she's awoken in one of these conditions, she won't remember what day it is or whether she's been awoken before, or she won't have any sense of how much time has passed. She doesn't remember anything except she remembers everything from Sunday and before, right? So she remembers all the rules that she was told on Sunday. She just doesn't remember anything from Monday and Tuesday. Right? So you might think when you wake up, oh, like maybe you feel like a lot of time has passed, so it's more likely to be Tuesday. No, you don't feel that way. And also you might remember on Tuesday that you had already been awoken on Monday, but no, that's also not the case. The drugs mess with her memory. And so when she's awoken on Tuesday, she doesn't remember that she already had been awoken once. It's just like the first time to her. Okay? Okay. And of course, Sleeping Beauty consents to all of this. And nobody does this kind of study for real. If you do, that's going to be a tough road that you have with the IRB at your institution, probably. It's just a thought experiment. But now the question is, imagine that you are Sleeping Beauty. You're put in this situation, and now you've just been awoken. So you know it's either Monday or Tuesday. The coin landed heads or tails. Could all be. It's all possible. But the question is, what is your subjective probability that the coin came up heads? What is your subjective credence, as the philosophers sometimes call it, right? But what probability do you assign to the event that the coin came up heads? That's the question. That's the key question in the Sleeping Beauty problem. And again, I encourage you to pause the video here and think about it for yourself. Okay, so having thought about it for yourself, you probably fall into one of two camps. Some people say that the answer should be 1/2, and other people say that the answer should be 1/3, that should be your subjective probability, your degree of belief that the coin came up heads. Why? Well, the people who say 1/2, they're called the halfers in the literature, and the halfers typically make an argument such as the following. On Sunday, if somebody asked you on Sunday, what do you think is the probability that the coin will land heads? Of course, you should say 50%, 1/2, right? Because we know it's a fair coin. That's clear. And then the argument continues, well, when you're woken up, you always knew that you were going to be woken up, right? It's clear that you're going to be woken up at some point. So you haven't learned anything new. That's the halfers argument. When you wake up, you haven't learned anything new since Sunday. All those rules you knew before, and also the fact that you would be woken up at some point you knew before. So you shouldn't update your belief. It should still be 50-50. So that's the halfers argument. A typical argument for the thirder goes something like the following. Imagine that you do this experiment every week for a year. Again, not recommended. But if you were to do it every week for an entire year, right? So every Sunday you toss the coin. So every Sunday you toss the coin independently. And then let's look at, let's make it to the end of the year and then we look back. So imagine looking back at the end of the year at how many times you were awoken in a heads week and how many times you were awoken in a tails week. And with pretty high probability, of all the awakenings that you had in the entire year, about a third of them will have been in heads weeks, right? That makes sense, right? Because probably about half the weeks were heads weeks. And so that means a third of the awakenings were heads weeks. In a third of all awakenings, heads would have been the right answer. So 1/3 is the correct answer. Okay. So those both seem like reasonable arguments. But obviously the conclusions are not consistent. One is 1/2 and one is 1/3. Okay. So I hope by this point you have chosen a camp. Most people naturally gravitate to one camp or the other, and that makes it kind of fun. And again, that's why it's a great thing to try with a couple of friends at a cocktail party or at a bar or something like that, and see where they fall, and you'll get a long discussion that unfortunately we can't have on the recording, but I hope you'll get that chance some other time. What does this have to do with AI? Well, actually, I think you can build the Sleeping Beauty example into some AI-based scenarios as well. So I'm here crafting a scenario really to fit the Sleeping Beauty problem. So it's a little bit exaggerated, but the basic idea, I think, comes across. So one way to interpret this is in the following story. Suppose you have self-driving cars, but with a low level of autonomy. So most of the time, a human is driving, and the AI only steps up and intervenes when it detects that the driver has made a major error. So we have to have a driver that makes major errors. Here's an example. This is Mr. Bean. He probably should be intervened on. But now, for privacy reasons, maybe you don't want your insurance to go up. The car does not keep a record of such an event. And now imagine that there are two types of drivers out there. Some drivers are good drivers, which means that in the course of their driving career with the car, they will make one major error. And some people are bad drivers, which means they'll make two major errors in the course of their driving career. And this is intended to be very analogous to what happened in the Sleeping Beauty problem. Because now what that means is that half the time the car is going to be, or the AI in the car is going to be woken up once, and half the time it's going to be woken up twice. And also, again, because the car doesn't keep a record of having been awoken, right, having been called upon, it's really in the same situation as the Sleeping Beauty problem, right? Whenever the AI system wakes up because it has detected that there's a major error, it doesn't remember whether it's been awoken before. And now, if you're the AI system, you might care about the probability that the driver is a good driver, because maybe you have to decide about whether to hand back control of the vehicle to the driver. So you should be thinking, if you're the AI system, about what's the probability that the driver is good. And this is exactly the Sleeping Beauty problem. Here's another story. Suppose that we place a bunch of very cheap sensors near a highway, and the goal is to keep wildlife, like deer, from walking onto the highway, right? Because maybe if they step on it, maybe we decide to beep or something like that. So we have a bunch of these cheap sensors. Let's suppose they don't communicate, they have no memory. And now there are two types of animals, deer, and a deer will typically set off two sensors, kind of big, and they're walking around. And then there are birds. So sometimes it's a bird setting off the sensor, but a bird typically will only set off one sensor. And now, from the perspective of the system or of a sensor that's just been set off, what is the probability that what set you off was a bird? And you might care about this because maybe you're not worried about birds going onto the road. Maybe they'll be fine on the road because they can fly away. I don't know about these birds that you see on the slide here, but maybe in general, you're not worried about that, but you'd be very worried about deer. Okay. And again, this is the same problem as long as the sensors don't communicate or don't have any memory. Okay. Because again, you can draw this similar picture. If it's a bird, there's going to be one awakening of the sensor. And if it's a deer, there are going to be two awakenings. So whether this example really works depends a little bit on how the sensors act and whether they are really distinct from each other. The example works best if it's a single sensor with no memory. But so hopefully that's enough to give you an idea why these kind of problems might come up in AI systems. So here I really tried to fit exactly the Sleeping Beauty problem into this kind of a scenario. But more broadly, we would certainly expect our AI systems to sometimes not remember something. Just very briefly, if you know extensive form games and game theory, this would be the information structure of the Sleeping Beauty problem. Nature or chance makes a move first, coming up either heads or tails. And then on Monday, player 1 will definitely have an awakening, and perhaps on Tuesday. And then the dotted line in game theory, this represents a single information set. So nodes that are connected by this dotted line, the player cannot distinguish between them. But a typical game or even a decision scenario would have also decisions in it, right? And payoffs maybe, right? So you might say, well, who cares what belief I form if it doesn't actually inform any actions that I take? And interestingly, that's actually one way to try to make progress on the question of what is the right answer to the Sleeping Beauty problem. And I should say that I don't think there's a full consensus on this yet, right? Still, even today, there are halfers and thirders out there. So unlike something like the Monty Hall problem, where the answers may be counterintuitive, but once you analyze it well enough, basically everybody agrees what the right answer is. That is not true for this problem. So can we make progress on this by thinking about decision theory? So is it possible, for example, to turn one of these positions into a money pump? Right, like we did before, arguably, with the causal decision theorist. And here's an argument that you can take advantage of a halfer. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to offer Beauty a bet whenever she awakens. She can take it or she can leave it. But the idea is we offer it to her every single time that she awakens. Because if we said something like, well, we're only going to offer it to her if it's a Monday, then the fact that you're offered a bet, if you're Beauty, will tell you something about which day it is. And so that would change your beliefs. So that's why we have to, whenever we offer a bet in this kind of an argument, we have to offer it to her every single time that she awakens. And the bet is going to be as follows. If you take the bet, if you're Beauty and you take the bet, and it turns out the coin landed heads, then you're going to make a profit. You're going to get 11 as Beauty. But if it landed tails, then you're going to run a loss. Beauty is going to have to pay 10. Right, so either receive 11 or pay 10. And so the argument is the halfer will take this bet, right, because the halfer believes it's 50-50 between those two options, and you receive a little bit more than you would pay if you're wrong, right, if it's tails. In all of this, we're assuming that Beauty is risk neutral, right? So in general, maybe you wouldn't take this because you might be risk averse, but we're going to assume that that's not the case. So the halfer will accept this bet. A thirder, by the way, won't, because the thirder thinks there's only a 1/3 chance of getting 11. That's not enough. Okay, but the halfer will accept it. And now let's see what happens. If the coin lands heads, then halfer Beauty is going to be offered this bet on Monday, is going to accept it, and is going to gain 11. But if it's tails, she will now actually be offered the bet twice, Monday and Tuesday. And each time she will take the bet. She won't remember that she already took it before, so she'll take it twice. And in each case, it doesn't pay off. She actually will have to pay 10. And so overall, she goes down by 20. Okay. And so now you see that this is probably not a good way to act if you're Beauty, right? On average, now you're losing money overall. And if you want to really drive this home, what you can also do is you can add another bet that is made to Beauty on Sunday. And this one will pay off for Beauty if it is tails. Right? And so you can kind of offset things in such a way that no matter what happens, Beauty always loses money. Right? So Beauty is a money pump. This kind of idea that you have a system of bets, a set of bets, such that somebody with a particular belief system would take all those bets, but together those bets are guaranteed to result in a loss. That is in the literature also known as a Dutch book. So this is a Dutch book against the halfer. Okay, so maybe now you say, okay, it's settled. Halving is not the right thing to do. By the way, so I said before how you represent this as a game, and now we also really have decisions. Right? So here I've added the decision of whether to take the bet or not. Not the Sunday bet, that's not in this picture. Okay, but actually it turns out there's a counter argument. So the halfer can still escape from this Dutch book. And the halfer, in fact, turns out to escape from it if the halfer adopts evidential decision theory. So now we're back to evidential decision theory. Because remember, the idea of evidential decision theory is that you should, when you consider an option, you should consider also what it would tell you about the world if you made that decision, and you should take that into account. And so here is how this actually works out. So if you're an EDT halfer and you're presented with that bet I just told you about, right? Then you would analyze it as follows. You would say, well, probability of 1/2, it's heads. And if so, I'll accept. So if I accept it, then I'll end up with 11. With the other probability 1/2, it's tails. But now, because you're an evidential decision theorist, you reason as follows. If you accept, then you accept on the other day as well. And so overall, you go down by 20. And if you don't accept, then you expect also not to accept on the other day. And so you will only have 0, right? And so once you take that evidential effect into account, you realize that it's a bad bet to take. Right? That overall, you're going to go down by 20. If you take it today, in all likelihood, you're taking it the other day as well if it's tails. And that means you would actually go down by 20. Whereas if you don't take it, it's just 0. Okay. Whereas, again, if you're a causal decision theorist, right? So then the Dutch book really does work. Because the causal decision theorist halfer would say, well, whatever I do now, I can't affect what happens on the other day, right? I'm making a decision about today only. And so if it's tails, then taking the bet costs me 10, but it doesn't cost me 20 because that's another decision I'm making at some other time. Maybe what I do now is evidence for that, but I'm not causing that to happen. And so that means that the CDT halfer will, in fact, take the bet and fall for the Dutch book. But the argument is the EDT halfer does not. It turns out if you're an EDT thirder, then you can also be Dutch booked. But there is a proof in the literature that says that if you're either an EDT halfer or a CDT thirder, then you cannot be Dutch booked, which is a really interesting thing that in some sense the decision theory goes together with the way in which you're supposed to form beliefs. Okay, so somehow if you're inclined to be a thirder, if that's the way you want to form beliefs, then you better adopt causal decision theory because otherwise you're going to be vulnerable to Dutch books. Whereas if you are a halfer, then you better adopt evidential decision theory. So goes the argument, though I'm a little bit skeptical of this argument. And I've argued that evidential decision theorists can be Dutch booked in a somewhat more general setting. And let me briefly show you how that works. So this slightly more general setting in which I claim that an evidential decision theorist can be Dutch booked as well is a Sleeping Beauty type of problem, but now there are different color rooms in which she wakes up. There's a white room, a gray room, and a black room. And in each one of those, she's woken up sometimes. There are 2 coins. One determines the color of the room, white or black, in which she's woken up first. And then the other coin, the second coin, determines whether she's woken up in a gray room or in the color room opposite to the one that she was woken up in first. Right? So here, WG, if that's the outcome of the coin tosses, then she'll be woken up in a white room first and then in a gray one, and so on. Okay. And then again, we're going to offer Beauty bets. We're going to offer her a bet on Sunday. This is just to make sure the whole thing is a Dutch book. But the Sunday bet, I think everybody is going to agree that you should take that bet. The Sunday bet is really a bet about the second coin, whether it's going to come up G or O, and it's going to pay out. It's going to pay out a little bit more if you win than if you lose, and so pretty much everybody would take this bet. Right? So the interesting bet is the other one that you're sometimes presented on Monday and Tuesday, and in fact, this bet you're given only in the white and black rooms. So if you're in the gray room on a day, you don't get this. You don't get offered this bet. Okay, but on either of the other days, you see the color of the room, and then you're presented the bet. And this bet is a bet about, again, the second coin. And it works as follows. If the second coin came up gray and you take the bet, it costs you 24. And on the other hand, if it came up O, then it pays out 9 to you. Okay, which is significantly less. And so if you add up, if you were to take both of these bets all the time, then you will actually go down in money. It will cost you money, so it's a Dutch book. So that means if you don't want to be vulnerable to Dutch books, you have to reject one or the other of these bets. Everybody is probably going to take bet 1, so it's really about bet 2. And so now the argument is here that actually in this particular example, I don't think there's a difference between thirding and halving. I think everybody will agree that if you wake up in a white room, you would assign probability 1/3 to each of the worlds WG, WO, and BO, because they all have one awakening in a white room. Okay. So it's really about causal versus evidential decision theory. If you're a causal decision theorist, you will say, well, there's a 1/3 chance of going down by 24. There's a 2/3 chance of going up by 9. So, but 18 is less than 24, so I'm not going to take the bet. So that is a good thing. That means that the causal decision theorist escapes the Dutch book. Okay. On the other hand, if you're an evidential decision theorist, now here I need to make one more assumption about evidential decision theory. If you've noticed, the whole situation here is entirely symmetric between white and black. So my argument is that if you make a decision in the white room, you're going to make the same decision in the black room, right? Because everything is basically the same. It's just the question of which color you're in. So if you accept the bet in the white room, you expect to also take it in the black room, and if not, then you expect not to take it. And now, if you're an evidential decision theorist, you say, okay, well, there's a 1/3 chance that I go down by 24 if I take this bet, but there's a 2/3 chance that I go up by 9, and then I also take it on the other day, so I go up by 9 again. Okay? And if you add in that effect, you're actually going to take the bet. But that's actually bad for you. You don't want to take this bet because it's going to subject you to a Dutch book. So this is my argument against EDT. So now it's kind of funny because I've shown you both a Dutch book against EDT and one against CDT earlier, right? In the kind of more Newcomb Demon kind of setup. So what do I actually believe? That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure yet, right? I think there are interesting arguments in favor of all of these decision theories. But what I will say is that I'm more inclined to be a thirder. I think thirding is the right answer and halving is not. Other people disagree with me, right? But that's what I think. And so now this actually gets into philosophy, or to some extent is already philosophy, but this gets even into maybe questions of metaphysics and theory of, or philosophy of mind. And why is that? So if I say that I'm a thirder, I have to have a counter argument to this first argument that the halver presented, which is that, well, on Sunday, you should believe it's 1/2 probability, which I completely agree with. And then the next part of the argument is, well, when you're woken up, you haven't learned anything because you always knew you were going to be woken up. So you haven't learned anything, so the probability should still be the same. And so that's where I disagree. But that means I have to argue why I disagree with that, because it sounds sensible enough. And so really, I'm conditioning on something, right? I'm saying when I wake up in just in the basic version of the Sleeping Beauty problem, right? When I wake up, when I'm awoken in a room, I've learned something. I'm conditioning on something that I didn't know before. But what is that? If I say what I'm conditioning on is there is an awakening, well, that's not news, right? In that case, I always knew there was going to be an awakening, so I haven't learned anything. So that shouldn't be causing me to update my belief. So I must be conditioning on something else. And so what I think we're conditioning on in that case is that I have just been awoken. Okay. And I think that's different. To say that I have just been awoken is different from saying that somewhere in time there is an awakening, even from saying somewhere in time I wake up, right? And so this is kind of interesting because what kind of a fact is this? And I'm conditioning on some kind of a fact, but what kind of a fact is that? This isn't a fact. Like if you think about the universe as a big four-dimensional space-time block and all the things that happen in it, you can talk about facts about that universe, right? But the kind of fact of I have just been awoken isn't a fact about the universe per se. It's a fact more specifically about my position in the universe, right? And this is sometimes what philosophers will call a centered fact. So this is kind of a strange, so it's some kind of fact that isn't just the basic fact about the universe. And so here I have some other philosophy work that actually doesn't really have any math in it or anything, but does have a little bit of a computer science flavor that I think ties to that notion of a fact. And so let me show it to you just a little bit further out there. I hope some of you will be interested in it. Let me just present it and then I'll move on. So most of us are computer scientists. And so one thing that we can imagine ourselves doing is building a big simulation of some simulated world with a lot of creatures in it, right? So we come up with this great simulated physics and we have these creatures walking around in it. And so I'm drawing the creatures here with 3 legs just to indicate that they're not necessarily like us, right? And there's some kind of physics in this simulated world. Maybe it's not quite like our own physics, but there's something like light in our simulated environment. Okay. So imagine I'm this brilliant programmer. I code it all up and I make no mistakes. That's not the truth. I make lots of mistakes when I write code, but just imagine. Except, so I finish it all. It compiles right away, and then I run it. But I actually did make one mistake because when I run it, nothing shows up on the screen. It's actually running perfectly, right? We've all made this mistake that we just forgot to output something to the screen, but actually everything is running just fine. And now, that's presumably not what we want to happen, right? Presumably what we really want to happen is then also for something to show up on the screen. For example, this is what might show up on the screen. So here, what shows up on the screen is the perspective of one of the creatures, right? Actually, it's the round-headed creature's perspective that shows up here under 2. And that actually might show up on the screen. And that's what we want. And so now my argument is that our own conscious experience, right? As I'm sitting here right now, I have a conscious experience of seeing the screen that I'm looking at. And that's more like 2 than like 1. But if you want to get from 1 to 2, it's not enough to just have coded up the physics of the simulation, right? That was the whole premise, that first we imagined that I coded up the physics and everything worked just fine, but still nothing was on the screen. And so to actually make something appear on the screen, I have to write some additional code. And the key thing is that as I write that additional code, I need to make some additional decisions. I need to decide in which colors to display the perception of the creature, right? So here I've chosen to do that in blue. That in some way corresponds to the simulated light, but I could have let it correspond to something else entirely. This is related to the inverted spectrum scenario in philosophy, if you know about that. And B, another thing that I have to answer when I write the additional code is how to choose the agent whose perspective I'm displaying. Good. And so that additional code contains some facts about the experience that I have looking at the screen, right? And so that suggests that, at least in my code, there are further facts in some sense. Besides all the code about the physics, there are also some more facts in the code about how to present it. And then again, the argument is that when I have an experience, right, or when I wake up in the Sleeping Beauty scenario, I have a conscious experience, and that is more like 2 than like 1. And so analogously, there are some facts over and above the facts of the universe as a whole that are kind of personal facts about where I am in the universe. Okay. So again, this shows you that you can take this problem and really go all the way into the depths of metaphysics and philosophy of mind with this. But now I'm going to zoom back out a little bit. And actually, I'll tell you about a somewhat related problem, the absent-minded driver problem, that is like the Sleeping Beauty puzzle, but has another twist to it that I think is interesting. So let's see how this one goes. It goes as follows. So the story here is that there is a driver that is on a highway. And it's a very monotonous highway. Nothing ever happens on this highway. And it's so boring that the driver just kind of forgets everything that happens. So you're kind of half asleep at the wheel. And every once in a while, the driver notices an exit and then has to decide whether to exit or not. And the driver wants to exit at the second exit. Right? So here in the picture on the right, you see that the driver starts at start and then drives down and has to make one decision at X. And then if the driver continues from X, we'll have to make another decision at Y, whether to exit or not. And those decisions determine where the driver ends up. So exiting right away at X gives you utility 0. Exiting at Y gives you utility 4. And continuing all the way gives you utility 1. And now the key thing here is that, so this would be very easy if you paid attention and knew whether you were at X or at Y, in which case you would continue at X and exit at Y. Done. But the key thing here is that, again, because of the monotony, when you reach an exit, you don't realize at which exit you are. If you're at Y, you've forgotten that you already passed an exit before. You don't feel like a lot of time has passed. So that's like how it's like the Sleeping Beauty problem. And so you have to make a decision separately. So you basically have to decide the same way, both at X and Y. The issue, though, is that if you take a deterministic strategy that says, like, well, I'll just always continue. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. That, like, okay, that way at least I get 1 if I always continue on the highway. But then if you did that, and now you wake up in an exit and you say, well, I know that my plan is to always continue, but given that my plan is to always continue, there is maybe a 50% chance that I'm currently at Y. So maybe I should exit, because then half the time I'll get 4, and that's better than getting 1. So in that sense, it's not stable, right? Because if you were always continuing, you would want to start exiting. But if you're always exiting, you would want to start continuing, because then probably you're at X. Okay, I hope that makes some sense. So it turns out one thing that you can do to at least do a little bit better is to randomize, right? So the right thing is, if you can't do anything else, is to randomize and sometimes exit. So you always exit with probability P when you reach an exit. And if you work out the math, you want to maximize your expected utility, then the right P to choose is 1/3. Right? So you can go through the math on the slide to make sure that that's right. But now we might wonder whether that's kind of stable, right? So before we said that, okay, well, if we adopt the always continue policy, we want to deviate from that when we're at an exit and exit. So, so the original paper that studied this problem, they said that this is how you would analyze it when you actually arrive at an exit, right? So imagine that you know that your plan is to always continue with 1/3, but now you think, well, boy, now I'm at an exit, and now do I maybe want to do something else? So their analysis is as follows. You say, well, if B is your belief, your subjective probability that you're at X, and you're deciding on which probability to choose to exit with, what is going to be your expected utility as a function of P? Well, they say it should be this, what's here on the slide, with probability 1 minus B. So that's the probability that you're at Y. And then so with probability P, then you would get 4, and 1 minus P, you would just get 1. So that's that first term. And then the second term says the probability that you're at X is B. And so then you would get 4 with probability 4 times P times 1 minus P. So the assumption there is that you will use the same P at Y. Keep that in mind. Okay, and so you work this all out, and it says that you should pick P star to be this formula as a function of B. Now, what should be B? If you really were using p equals 1/3, which overall is optimal, then you would expect to be at you would expect to be at x 3/5 of the time. Right? You're going to be at x a little bit more often because sometimes you exit from x. But then if you use this analysis, you would say, well, you would actually set p star equals 2/3. So this also doesn't seem to be stable. So something seems to be wrong here. But also, it's not totally clear that this argument works, right? Because there's some kind of EDT reasoning in there, because we said that if you use p at x, you're also going to use p at y. But maybe b should depend on p, and it's all a little bit funny. And so what we would like to see is some kind of theory according to which the optimal policy is stable. So here was a follow-up analysis that did get that result. And this is actually really more along the lines of being a thirder or a causal decision theorist. So imagine that you normally expect to play p equals 1/3 should you deviate this time, but this time only. So unlike the analysis before, we say, well, this time you're going to do something different, but that doesn't change what you would do at the other node. So you would still play the p equals 1/3 at the other node. And if you go through the analysis now, if you exit, your expected utility is going to be 8/5. And if you continue, the expected utility will also be 8/5. And that's the result we want, because that means you're indifferent between exiting and continuing, which means you're fine randomizing. You're not going to be incentivized to deviate from your plan of playing 1/3. Okay, so that works on this example. And it turns out actually it always works. So the optimal policy will always be stable in this sense, if you think along these thirder or causal decision theory lines. So now the question is there some way to also make EDT work with some way of forming beliefs? And this is kind of a tricky question. And I figured at some point there was, and I gave a talk on this in Australia some time ago. And I figured, like, oh, I have the weekend there. I'll work this out before my talk on Monday. And I tried and I couldn't do it. And I was frustrated with myself. And I went out with some people, and then we had some fun. And the next morning, I was only barely awake, also because of the jet lag. And then this example came to me that I thought really killed EDT, right? In the sense that there's no way to get the right answer with EDT. So here's a different example. So now actually we're going to go from the bottom up, which I think is easier to think about. So now you have at each decision point, you can also you can choose to exit, but you can choose to exit left or right, or to keep going. But again, you can't tell the difference between X and Y because you forget. And now you see all the payoffs here. If you look at this example for a little while, you'll convince yourself that the best thing you can do here is just go left and take that 1. You can try to go for the 4 minus epsilon on the top right. But the best way you might do that is to just go straight half the time and right half the time. And then you're going to get there only with probability 1/4. So it's not going to be as good as 1. So now what does EDT say you should do? So here was my argument, right? So you could consider the strategy of just always going left. Well, then presumably, if you're considering that strategy, you expect to get 1 because you expect to be at X. You would never get further than X. On the other hand, let's consider the other strategy that seems to make sense, which is to sometimes half the time go forward and half the time exit right. Now, you must have some probability that you're at Y at this point. Let's say that's B. And all we're going to assume about B is that at least it's greater than 0. Right? Presumably, with this strategy, you would think there's some chance that you're now at Y. If you're always using the strategy, you must be having some chance of being at Y now. And we also say we're also going to assume that B is not somehow related to epsilon, which doesn't seem to make sense that it would depend on epsilon. And then you would argue as follows. Well, with probability B, if you adopt this policy, you have a 1/2 chance of getting 4 minus epsilon. With probability 1 minus B, you still have a 1/4 chance of ending up at 4 minus epsilon. Overall, that's going to end up being greater than 1, right? At least if you make epsilon small enough. But we said B doesn't depend on epsilon. And that means that EDT will suggest doing the second strategy, right? And that's in some sense the wrong answer, because overall that does not give the highest expected utility. So I thought that was it. And I sent this example to Kasper Osterheld, a PhD student, and he wrote back to me, no, Vince, you're doing the analysis wrong. And he showed me a way to do the analysis with EDT that actually works and gets the right answer. Right? So and at this point, I was kind of confused. And also, I was kind of doubtful of my own example, given that I came up with it in a not very awake state. So here was Kasper's way of doing it. So when you're thinking about where you are, you really should be thinking about the whole trajectory and where you are in a halving sort of way. So what the first expression here says, the probability that we follow the path from x to y to the 4 minus epsilon payoff, and we're currently at x, you should calculate that at first of all as the probability of taking that whole path, and multiply that by the probability that we're currently at x, given that we're on that path somewhere. And the idea is the probability of that whole path under this strategy is 1/4. And the probability that we're at x, given that we're on that path, there are two nodes in that path that we can be on, and they have equal probability. So we should multiply that by 1/2. And similarly, if you want to figure out the probability that we're on the same path, but currently at y, you get the same answer. Okay, so those are two trajectories, two places. That's one trajectory and two places on it that we can be. Any other trajectory that we might be on is, with this strategy, is going to give us 0 payoff. So we don't really need to consider those from the perspective of expected payoff. And so our expected utility, conditional on having woken up somewhere and following this strategy, if you work it out, it ends up being a little bit less than 1, as expected from the perspective of the globally optimal policy. So EDT gets the right answer. And at this point, I was just really confused, because this argument seems to make perfect sense. And so this is one way you can get the right answer with evidential decision theory. And yet, I thought I had shown an argument that couldn't possibly happen on the previous slide. And it turns out something really weird is happening with this way of thinking. Because if you use this way of forming probabilities, if you tell me that I'm at x, then it's more likely that I'm on the trajectory x and then exit to 0 than that I'm on one of the trajectories where I go through y. Okay, even holding the policy fixed of going straight with 1/2 and right with 1/2. And here is kind of the math that shows that, because the probability that I'm on the long path for x, y, or that I'm on the path x, y, and then the good payoff, and at x, that's 1/4 for that path times 1/2 for being at that node on that path. I could also be at x while being on the long path to 0, so x, y, and then straight to 0, and that has the same probability. Or I could be on the path that just exits from x to the right, and that path has probability 1/2. But now, conditional on being on that path, I'm definitely at x. Okay, there's no other. I'm not going to reach y. And so that's what makes the key difference. And so if you do the math, it actually says given that I'm currently at x, given this policy, if you do the probability calculation this way, it says that given that I'm currently at x, I'm more likely to be about to exit to the right. There's a probability of 2/3 that I'm exiting to the right, in spite of the fact that I use this policy that says I'm going to go straight with probability 1/2 and not 1/3. So this is really strange, right? So this tells you that where you are, so implicitly in this way of doing the analysis, where you are gives you information about coin tosses that you're about to make in the future. So that's really weird, right? So you're about to use this coin. You know it's a fair coin, but also because of the way that you're using, that you're doing belief formation and the way you're using this coin in your policy, you think that there is automatically a bias to your coin, not because the coin is biased, but because of the way in which the coin is being used. So this is really mind twisting. If that didn't make sense, I'm not surprised, because it's a complicated thing to get your head around. But in a way, it's really interesting as well. So you could say from this, well, this way of doing EDT is just too strange. So maybe the causal decision theory way of doing things is better. That's a reasonable conclusion, but I think there's something interesting about this way of thinking. Anyway, I want to briefly mention a few more things. I'm almost out of time. So there are a couple other decision theories. One is functional decision theory, which tries to combine some elements of both. The details of that are a little bit more complex, but one way to interpret it is that you're always going to act as you would have pre-committed to act. Okay. And that, I think, avoids my Dutch book against EDT. This was still one box in Newcomb's problem, right? Because you would, if you were to make a decision as to what to commit to do all the way at the outset before the daemon even puts money into the boxes, then you want to commit to one box, because that means that the daemon will put $1 million in the one box. Weirdly, though, this one will even one box in Newcomb's problem with transparent boxes. What does that mean? It's just Newcomb's problem, but you can actually see what's inside the boxes. You already see what's in there. And that seems kind of strange, right? It seems like in that world, if you can really see what's in the boxes, you probably want to take both boxes. But this decision theory says, well, you just always do what you would have pre-committed to do. And the argument from before still holds. You would still pre-commit if you got to commit all the way at the outset before the daemon put money in the boxes. You would commit to just taking one box, because that means that the daemon is going to put $1 million in the one box. Here's another weird example. You can imagine that a different decision scenario where the daemon is worried that you will press a button that will destroy everything, which costs everybody $1 million. And the daemon will send you $1,000 before that. If the daemon believes that otherwise, if it doesn't send you the $1,000, you're going to destroy everything. But if it sends you the $1,000, you won't. And what FDT says here now gets a little bit weird to me, because this says that even if you find out that you're playing this game only after the entity has already decided not to send you the money, the daemon has already decided not to send you the money, and now you find out you're playing this game, according to FDT, you would still destroy everything, right? Even though it's already too late. Because that's still what you would have pre-committed. You would have pre-committed yourself to destroy everything if the daemon didn't send you the money, in order to make sure that the daemon sends you the money and you wouldn't have to destroy everything. But even when it's too late, FDT says you still do this. Okay. Briefly, I want to mention another concept, program equilibrium, which is an interesting one. So this is this is a different kind of solution concept. So here we're thinking about the fact that when we're thinking about AI making decisions, well, we have a program making decisions, and we can make code legible to other programs. Right? So what can you achieve when you make your own code legible to other players? And this turns out to give you an interesting way to cooperate in the prisoner's dilemma. Because you can play this program, right? So now a strategy is a program, and the program you might play is that if the other player uses the exact same code as I do, then cooperate, otherwise defect. And if you both play that, then you will in fact cooperate, and you'll both be better off. And you won't want to defect, because if you, right, in particular, you don't want to play any other program, because any other program that you play will result in the other player defecting, and that's not good for you. So you want to play this particular program. So that's nice. It may seem a little bit brittle that, okay, everybody has to play the exact same program. That gives kind of no room for innovation or anything like that. There are more flexible ways to do this. So Casper Oesterheld has a nice paper where instead of doing that program that we looked at before, here's kind of a more general thing that you can do, still in the same framework, that you can say, you can play the strategy that's a little bit more like tit for tat. Tit for tat in game theory says that, well, the first round I'll cooperate, and after that I'll just do whatever you did to me the previous round. Now, this is actually not a repeated game here. This is a single shot game, but it still has the same kind of idea. So you say with probability epsilon, I'll cooperate, and otherwise I'm going to do what the other program does against this program. And so that's a little bit more robust than what we saw before. I'm going to very briefly mention our Amos paper this year, where we also think about this kind of a framework where you can do delegated game playing. So instead of playing the game yourself, you can hand it over to a representative. And now we're assuming that those representatives are themselves very capable game players, right? So instead of giving them necessarily very detailed instructions for which specific action they should take, we just give them utilities and say, well, you should play according to these utilities, and then try to do the best you can. Or you can even give kind of a conditional instruction like that to say that, well, if the other player does the same thing, right? So there's the program equilibrium idea again. If the other player does the same thing, then you should consider these to be the utilities. And this allows you to sometimes get Pareto improvements, meaning that everybody is better off as a result of this happening, relative to what would have happened without this kind of commitment, even in cases where straightforward program equilibrium is a little bit difficult to implement, because it's not totally clear what equilibrium would have resulted without the representatives. So I don't really have time to go through this in detail, but I'm happy to talk about this paper if you're interested. And then we're basically at the end, so I just want to wrap up and say, okay, well, what was the point of this whole tutorial? I think traditionally AI has taken this model of how to build an agent that's really inspired by the Homo economicus model, right? Which is typically associated with rational behavior, but also implies that the agent, the entity, isn't distributed over space. There aren't multiple copies of the agent running around. The agent has full memory and has some kind of tastes that are exogenously determined. And this model, I argue, that's been the main point of this whole tutorial, is not always appropriate for AI. Because we actually need to think about what the objective function should be. We get to choose it, right? We're not obliged to put any specific utility function in there whatsoever. We can decide what it should be. And so we should carefully think about that, which will also have strategic ramifications. And besides this issue of the objective function, there's this issue of the identity of the agent. Where are the boundaries of the agent, right? For example, the agent might consist of multiple nodes, and these nodes may not all share information with each other. So beliefs will be locally different. And that leads to different new questions about how to form beliefs and also how to make decisions. And I think that the foundations of social choice theory, decision theory, game theory actually give us a really solid foundation to really start addressing these issues. And I think there's still a lot of open questions here because for so many years in AI, we've just been thinking about this agent model that's very anthropomorphic. I think that doesn't actually reflect real practice. And that creates a nice opportunity to do something new and also to bring up some of these old examples in philosophy that most people thought were just kind of fanciful, that yes, they're interesting, but that doesn't really happen in real life, because in real life, like maybe I forget something sometimes, but it's not like I systematically always forget that. I know that I'm going to forget something for sure, for example, right? So that was more kind of the Sleeping Beauty scenario, or these cases where I'm being perfectly predicted, or I'm perfectly similar to the other person. For human beings, that doesn't make sense, but for AI, I'd say it really does. And I think there's still a lot of open questions here. For one, all these decision theories that we've looked at have had some downsides. So there's a big open question of what is now really actually the right way to do these things from the perspective of the AI researcher. Let me conclude with that. So normally at this point, I would take questions and we would have some nice discussion. That unfortunately, with this recorded version, we don't have the opportunity to do that. Maybe some of you will still even make it to the live tutorial. I don't know when you're seeing this, but in any case, please feel very free to send me email with any kind of questions. My email address is my last name, Konitzer@cs.duke.edu. So you can email me there and I'll respond to your questions. You can also follow me on social media or whatever you like to do. So thank you very much for watching this. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will enjoy all of AAAI. Thank you very much.